Usually, a ZX Spectrum game, however good, is a game of its time. Not necessarily just because of the colours or speed or general technical prowess, but because they feature a style of gaming that, even if it's still good, isn't something you see much nowadays. They don't really make platformers like Manic Miner anymore, they don't make adventures like Head Over Heels, and even arcade games are usually more complex than something like Jetpack. It's rarer, but also joyous, to find a game from that time that in many ways does feel like something modern, that you could actually imagine playing now. And while you'll find a lot of excellent modern homebrew that fits the bill, when it's a game from back in the day, well, that's a serious gem indeed. And today we're covering such a game, Rex from 1988. You could put this in all sorts of categories: platformer, shoot 'em up, adventure. You could even consider it a sort of Metroidvania. It's very different to many other games of its time, and it's very much worth a detailed look. You play as the titular Rex, this hulking rhino-esque mercenary, and you have a job to do. Humans have expanded outside of Earth and are now ruining various other planets in the galaxy, including a previously pretty one called Zenith. There's a load of humans there that you have to kill who have made a base at a place called the Great Tower and are sucking out all the energy from the planet. It's your mission to destroy it, and you'll do so using what the inlay calls the greatest weapon system yet seen, capable of tearing enemies asunder in a mass of sound and colour. The game itself runs on all spectrums above 48K and including 48K, and actually consists of a couple of different full loads. There's two parts to the game, both of which have to be loaded from scratch, and there's also a roll-in demo that shows the beginning of Rex's mission and also functions as a tutorial. That in itself is something different. It's very rare for a Spectrum game to feature any kind of tutorial at all, let alone one that's more than a screen telling you what the keys do. That should clue you in on this game being a little bit more complex than most. How did the game come about? Well, that's a bit of an odd one in a few ways. Rex is credited to a team called The Light, consisting of John Anderson, Neil Harris and Richard Allen. However, if you look these people up, you won't find any credit for them aside from Rex. Was this a one-hit wonder? A trio that came together, created one superb game, then just vanished? Well, no, they don't actually exist. The real team of developers behind Rex is called Creative Reality. John Anderson is Jason Austin, Neil Harris is Neil Dodwell, and Richard Allen is David Dew. So what's the story behind the name change? For this we go to the pages of Retrogamer, and a very nice feature all about Rex's creation, penned by the awesome Graham Mason. Creative Reality were largely partnered up with publishers Martech, and they'd already had a couple of games that pushed the specky a bit, games like 1986's Tarzan and WAR. They also made a couple of games based on 2000 AD licenses. 1987's Nemesis the Warlock is a good one, and there's also Slain, which is, well, one of the strangest specky games I can think of, a sort of action and text adventure hybrid. All was good, but then Creative Reality did drop a bit of a clanner with 1988's The Fury, a post-apocalyptic driving game. It looks good, but the game flopped, and to be honest it isn't a particularly good game at all. After The Fury got such a poor reception, Creative Reality were pretty well convinced that Martech were about to drop them. The only thing they had in their pocket was an early demo for something that was then called the Peeps game, which would evolve into Rex. It didn't consist of much except a character jumping around and shooting a stickman, but Martech were happy with it, and so the demo saved their bacon. Creative Reality then decided, just for this game, to adopt a new identity in order to disassociate themselves from their recent flop. A bit of an extreme thing to do perhaps, but they weren't taking any chances. And that's how we end up with the Light's one and only game, the almighty Rex, which was at one stage called Zenith, but because there was a window company named Zenith Windows, they decided against that. Anyway, it's about time to get deep into it and see just how this game's one that not only triumphed back then, but still really shines today. I mean, it starts well enough with one of the Specky's most memorable loading screens, but the play is something else. What can our hero do? Well, he can fire and jump around, for a start. He also has several important systems at his disposal. Obviously he's got his weapon, and we'll get there, But the shield is even more important. The shield is a bubble that's triggered by pressing down, and with it, Rex is immune to shots. If he's hit without the shield, he's toast. You can move around with the shield just fine, but naturally it has a limited lifespan, one that can be depleted even faster if shots and enemies hit it. However, you can recharge the shield at various pods that are dotted around the place. Then, of course, you have Rex's gun. His dispenser of agony comes in 5 different flavours, starting with a regular machine gun, upgrading to a twin shot, a laser that goes through enemies, a circle of drones that fires lots of shots forward, and then a multi-directional projectile launcher that has a couple more modes, a 3-way spray, a 4-way spray, and lastly an 8-way spray that basically murders anything on the screen. You collect most of these weapons in the beginning, but you can't use them until you upgrade your power, and you collect that from dead enemies. One other cool thing is that with some weapons, you can juggle regular enemies just by shooting them repeatedly. Doing so gives you a points bonus, which you can see on the top of the display. And lastly, you do also have a couple of smart bombs that you can use if you're in a pinch. All told, that's a lot of different tools at your disposal, especially for a Spectrum game. The first thing that may well strike you is the quality of the graphics. For the 48K Spectrum, they are absolutely amazing. So bright and colourful, and so many different sprites to look at, including a couple of large bosses. And there's not an ounce of the old colour clash to be found anywhere. By 1988, when this game was released, having colour clash in Spectrum games was seen as a big no-no, so it had to be avoided. As we've seen in other vids, like the various ones about arcade ports to the Spectrum, one of the more common ways around that was simply to make the game monochrome. But Rex manages to deploy an awful lot of colour, mainly in the background layer, while keeping most of the sprites white save for explosions and what have you. It's all nice and clever, and in Retrogamer, Jason Austin cited the excellent Dan Dare Pilot of the Future, another game we've looked at, as being a big inspiration behind Creative Reality's approach to Rex's graphics. Indeed, the second part of the game, the Zenith Tower, is very much like Dan Dare in terms of graphics and the hefty use of blue. Technical excellence aside, Rex is simply a triumph just from the artistic point of view. There's so many memorable surroundings, enemies and what have you, and so many things that really stick in the mind when compared to other Specky games, that for me it has to go down as one of the best looking games on the system, certainly from its commercial period. Another thing that helps here, of course, is the amount of action. Rex is most certainly not an empty game. In fact, it'll throw an absolute ton of enemies and projectiles at you. The game is very tough, and you've got to move around very carefully. Deploying your shield is an absolute must. Without it, you will be killed in short order, so you've got to make sure there's always some shield in reserve. It's generally quite fair when it comes to difficulty, even if it can be frustrating at points. There are thankfully an awful lot of checkpoints in the game, which is another touch that makes the game feel more modern. It does all this while also keeping the game running at a smooth pace. It's not a fast game, but it moves nicely. Some critics did knock the game a bit at the time for being small and not having a lot of big sprites, but in all honesty the style of Rex nowadays has held up a lot better than other games with big sprites like, say, Trantor the Last Stormtrooper, and the gameplay here is undoubtedly far superior. Still, yeah, it's going to give you a tough time. You've got to keep moving as well. It may feel like you've got to spend a little while planning a route and what have you, but you will be killed if you dawdle in a screen for a bit too long, and naturally you only have a few lives and no continues to play with. If you're playing on an emulator, you may well want to make liberal use of save states, especially as the game gets into its second half, where the enemies just get nastier and the environment gets even more hostile, with plenty of plants and growths that'll kill you on contact. What other unique things can you find in Rex then? Well, there's some different paths and secrets dotted around. It might be a bit of a stretch to call a game a Metroidvania, as it is generally quite linear, but there are some alternative routes, and the act of finding the different weapons and gradually upgrading Rex to make him even more of a killing machine does make the game something of a distant cousin. There's the opportunity to power up or power down. You find these items dotted around and they'll give you a slot machine of sorts that you have to stop. Sometimes it'll help you, sometimes it'll hinder you. Again, not something you usually see in games on this computer. And of course, there's the whole second part. At the end of the first part, you get a code that you have to write down. Having done that, you reset the computer, load up side B, and then input the code to continue the game in the Zenith Tower with everything that you've found previously. The only thing that the game doesn't really have is that much of an ending. The final boss is a memorable sight, but it doesn't actually do a lot and dies in a few shots, at which point you get a simple message. With the big squidgy thing destroyed, Rex can go home and have a nice cup of tea and put his feet up. As is often the case with Specky games, this final sequence was done right at the very end of the game's 4-month development cycle, and there wasn't much time to put an awful lot more in. This is one of the few regrets that the Creative Reality team had when it came to Rex, wishing that the final screen of the game had a bit more challenge to it. That said, there's more than enough challenge in the rest of the game to make up for it. Generally speaking, Rex got the reaction that it deserved. It was a great critical success, getting high scores from Crash, Your Sinclair and Sinclair User, with any of the aforementioned little criticisms that reviewers had largely cast aside in favour of the game's exceptional play. It really doesn't feel like a Spectrum game from 1988. It's one that's more than stood the test of time, and it's still quite mind-boggling to think that you can play it on the 48K Specky, a machine that was already 6 years old by the time that this game came out. Even when you look at the games that were amongst the greatest technical achievements of the system's early years, the games by Ultima and what have you, comparing those to something like Rex shows how far people were able to push the exact same hardware. While it is certainly a difficult time, it's not even one that falls too far into the trap of being hideously unfair that a lot of old Spectrum games tend to fall in. Jason Austin mentions in the Retro Gamer article that back in these days there weren't really such things as focus groups or dedicated playtesters, and that was a big reason why a lot of Spectrum games tended to be so tough, because testing was purely the job of the dev team who were intimately familiar with the title. But even with that in mind, Rex remains a challenging but not wholly irritating experience. It's a classic Spectrum game for sure, but a classic that feels different from so many of its contemporaries, the sort of game that's a real showcase for both the underrated prowess and the importance of the computer. It's worth taking a little bit of time here at the end to look at the various other things that Creative Reality and its members got up to. The team didn't work on another 8-bit game together, but you can find them on a couple of other projects after Rex. Jason Austin did the Specky version of Altered Beast, for example, which, yes, doesn't play particularly well, although it certainly does look and sound very good. Neil Dodwell and David Dew would move on from Rex to another great game. They handled the Spectrum version of System 3's Myth History in the Making. This is another one of the system's great showcases. It ended up being the best version of the game, even in the eyes of a dedicated C64 head like System 3's boss, Mark Cale, and it's a highly playable action-adventure platformer that once again shows off all the best things about the Specky. Creative Reality would go into a different and thoroughly more violent direction in the 16-bit era. They were behind 1994's Dreamweb, a rather controversial and brutal cyberpunk adventure, before releasing their final game, Martian Gothic Unification, in 2000. Austin, Dodwell and Dew have all had lengthy industry careers, with credits on a whole assortment of games. But when they say that Rex is one of, if not the best thing that they ever worked on, certainly back in the 8-bit years, well, it's pretty tough to disagree. As tough as a vicious Reno Sapien with a massive gun juggling your corpse for a laugh. Bye for now. Calling something the ZX Spectrum's greatest first-person shooter might sound a little, well, odd to some people, or even ridiculous. Why not call something the Specky's greatest virtual reality game, or the Specky's greatest online battle royale based MMORPG? After all, I'm sure that the idea of an FPS on the Spectrum is just as preposterous for some people as games in those genres would be. But while the field of first-person games on the Speccy is admittedly quite thin on the ground, this title isn't actually clickbait. There is a game that's worth showing off, something that's most definitely playable and worthy of an examination, not just a purely technical curiosity. It's definitely worth the trouble to have a look at a game by a man named Oleg Origin called quite simply The Dark, and to see how someone created an FPS on the 48K ZX Spectrum that was, shockingly, actually playable, as well as being technically very decent. You may well be curious to see that The Dark is something of an original title, rather than an attempt to convert Doom to the ZX Spectrum. Indeed, you may well have seen the odd attempt at a version of Doom on the Speccy on a YouTube video here and there. All of these versions, as well as the game we're covering, are from the mid-late 90s and are of Eastern European origin, mostly Russia and a little bit of Ukraine. Some of them have cool colours and music going for them, but they do tend to fall more within the technical curio category as opposed to being something more playable, usually only being a few minutes long at most. Also, they tend to work better with beefed up unofficial Russian speccies that run things like TR-DOS and what have you, like the Pentagon. One big difference between Doom clones like this and Oleg Origin's The Dark is that The Dark runs on a bog standard 48K Spectrum without any problems. Also, it's a full game with 8 beefy levels. The game, as mentioned, is originally a mid-late 90s release. It came out in 1997 on a self-released compilation by Origin called 1997. You can also find a couple of other games here, but The Dark is the main one. Funnily enough, it also started out life as a take on a more famous FPS. Originally it was called Quake, before acquiring its more unique identity. The original Quake release from 1997 is a bit of a hazy one. Again, this one falls more into the technical curio category of the other FPS attempts, with more direct tributes to the contemporary FPSs of the time, and other things like, a garbled bit of speech at the start. It also doesn't run particularly well, and the graphics aren't quite there yet. It certainly got a bit of attention at the time, but really it would take another 20 years before the game made its mark outside of the Eastern Europe homebrew Speccy scene. In 2017, Oleg Origin went back to his old Speccy FPS and re-released it as The Dark, giving it a considerable clean-up in the process. This version runs a fair deal smoother, removes things like the Quake logos that are everywhere, and the graphics have been given a bit of a boost too. And the game attracted a fair bit of attention from the whole of the Speccy world and even a little bit beyond. People were certainly curious to see a classic corridor-style FPS running this well on a frickin' Spectrum. The release that I'm mainly using for this video, however, is from 2021. The Dark Redux is the definitive and presumably final release for the game, and it's been made in collaboration with Zosia, the world's hottest Speccy group, and the ones responsible for various staggering bits of code you may have seen lately on the system, games like Valley of Rains, Travel Through Time, and Angels. The Redux release gets another little glow up with a far improved interface, an even more impressive graphical sheen, and the addition of a prequel of sorts that we'll look at after the main game. All in all, certainly worth a look. As with all of Zosia's games, physical boxed versions are available, but they're free to download from their website if you just want a tape image. While the game itself doesn't have a soundtrack, there are a couple of free songs available on Zosia's Bandcamp in mod or original AY versions that are meant to be played alongside the game in your player of choice. The game itself is a fantasy-based FPS where you play as Alexander, son of a woman named Jane who lived in the Land of Winds before dark forces took over and killed most of the residents. When you come of age, you resolve to take back your homeland, grabbing your trusty trident and a gun and setting to work. Simple enough plot, but told with a very effective introduction, certainly a pretty good one for the Speccy. As stated, the style of The Dark is very much that of a classic corridor FPS. There's several types of monsters around the place, switches you have to hit, and keys that you have to find. Pretty much what you would expect from various FPSs of this vintage really, only on a much less powerful system. As far as technical quality goes, what we are seeing here is amazing. The Dark runs pretty damn quickly, and the graphics are very good. The game is virtually entirely built out of 8x8 squares. Naturally, there's plenty of black borders on display, meaning there's a good reason as to why the whole game takes place at night. This does allow the game to throw quite a few enemies at you. This isn't just something where you'll be fighting 1 or 2 enemies at a time, and indeed there will be quite a few big hordes sent in your direction. All of this happens without the game really slowing down at all, and it once again must be stressed that this is all on a bog standard 48K Spectrum with no tricks or boosts or anything whatsoever. That's an absolutely awesome achievement, no matter which way you slice it. The game isn't even freaking multi-load, it sticks everything onto the specky during the very first load. Pretty incredible that. The game can be pretty tough. You do only have 2 weapons, and the trident is only really useful in a serious pinch. The gun starts with no ammo, but you can find boxes of bullets if you have a hunt around for them. However, they aren't exactly plentiful. It's quite important to pick your fights. If you can avoid certain enemies, it's best to do so, as if you go around trying to shoot everything, you're going to run out of bullets pretty fast. Part of this is down to the controls. Because of the 8x8 nature of the game, alignment can be a little tricky at times, especially from distance, and you'll miss a fair few shots. Indeed, it can at first be a little tricky to line up your movement in order to collect items efficiently. This is something you have to get a bit used to, another foible of the game's graphics. It's a little funky, but I'm not sure if there's any other real way to make a fast-moving FPS like this one on the Spectrum, other than the method Lato Lega Region went with, especially on the standard hardware. You kinda have to get used to it. Most of the enemies are these speedy lizard type things that move back and forth, not necessarily tracking you, but they'll usually come in hordes. 3 shots is enough to deal with them, but they move quickly and can be tough to hit. Bigger monsters do track you and are a bit easier to hit, but they take more bullets. Insects can't be hit and are stationary, providing a simple obstacle, and the Grim Reaper will roughly track you in open areas. He also cannot be killed and is just best evaded. There are a few other little obstacles dotted around, as well as cosmetic features such as the dragon that can often be seen in the sky. Oh, and harmful drops of water, because this is a European game after all. So, is the game actually worth playing? Is it still something of a tech demo? Well, no, it's more than that, for sure. It's not necessarily the greatest FPS title that you'll ever play, but it's absolutely serviceable enough when it comes to traditional old-school action in the genre. It does certainly have its foibles, of course. You might get a bit lost in the walls at times, seeing as they're mostly solid colours, and there isn't a whole lot in the way of notable landmarks in the levels aside from the corpses of big monsters that you create. But that said, you do have a full map of each level that can be accessed anytime, which does help matters. The Dark is a perfectly okay FPS if you enjoy the old corridor style, and that's speaking in general, not just for the Spectrum where it is obviously leagues ahead of anything else that could be considered part of the genre. It most definitely shows off the processing power of the Z80 compared to the chips on other systems. There is no way at all you could get anything even close to this on a Commodore 64, not with the base hardware. In the end, the best thing I could say about The Dark is that I would be happy to compare it to other first-person shooters of the time, all of which are running on systems that are dozens upon dozens of times more powerful than a humble 48K Spectrum. To have anything at all like this on a system from 1982 is utterly phenomenal. But wait, we're not quite done. When Zosia released the Redux version of The Dark, it also came with a prequel game, The Dark, The Lost Pages, an entirely new affair. Now you might expect this to be akin to an expansion with a couple more levels to play with and not too much else, but it is in fact a totally full new game. 9 more levels of first-person action, and a side-scrolling maze level to begin things, again running on a 48K Spectrum. Zosia don't really do things by halves, it has to be said. The Lost Pages is certainly another dazzling release, although also something of a bold one. The side-scrolling part of the game comes first, where you have to collect the aforementioned Lost Pages that function as maps for the FPS levels to come, and the style is somewhat similar to their earlier game, the modern classic Valley of Rains, albeit not nearly as busy. It's actually quite a large maze in fact. It'll take you a good chunk of time to get through it and you may well end up getting lost. It's all perfectly good, but it might be a bit of an annoyance for those who want to get purely into the shooting action that the original game was known for. One wonders if it might have been best to make this part optional. The FPS part does feature another nice new sheen on the graphics and the play. You do get a fair few new enemies, including the big old dragon in the background this time. The HUD has been made even cleaner, and there's other cool touches like Alexander's pistol actually moving as he goes forward. That's a nice trick indeed to pull off here on the Specky. A lot of things do stay the same, with the game having a pretty similar style to the original, although there's a chance for some different levels now and again. The first one, for example, is an arena filled with monsters that you must largely avoid while trying to find a key that has several random locations. So yeah, it's not all corridors this time. The FPS part is good, so long as you can get to it, and on the whole, well, it's nice to see a sequel to the game. That said, those who purely want a spot of FPS action on an antiquated system may prefer to stick to the original's Redux version. But on the whole, these are classic bits of Specky homebrew from some of the best folks who do it these days, and The Dark most certainly wants a place it deserves as one of the best homebrew and technical achievements on the system, even if it did pretty much take 20 years for it to get there. It is funny really. You could argue that the Specky, or indeed the even earlier ZX81, did play host to one of the earliest important first-person gaming experiences out there, 3D Monster Maze. It may well have taken 36 years for the computer to make another neat little mark on the almighty genre, but it's one that's absolutely worth having a look at. Bye for now. A few months ago, I had a look at Mastertronic as a company and concentrated a fair bit on their failed venture into the arcades, the Arcadia Super Select system, an intriguing subject, one that the almighty Neil over at RMC's also covered recently, trying to restore an example. This Mastertronic video is more about the games, 10 of them to be precise, but these are all ZX Spectrum titles that were my childhood favourites from the big old budget studio growing up, the ones that I remember playing and enjoying the most. 'Cause, well, let's face it, there are a lot of Mastertronic games, and most of them were released on multiple platforms, so covering them all at once would be pretty damn difficult. So instead, these are my favourites from childhood, a big old slab of nostalgia. Now, this isn't meant to be the absolute best Mastertronic games in any way. Quite a few of these aren't exactly amongst their most famous titles, and you will find that a lot of their most famed games are missing. For example, I never played any of the Finders Keepers games when I was a child, so if you come here expecting Spellbound or Nighttime, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. Indeed, just because these are childhood favourites doesn't necessarily mean they've held up nowadays. But it'll be a pleasant trip down memory lane. A good chunk of these are games that I still enjoy, and they're all games that were originally published by Mastertronic. While there's a good few re-releases of full-price titles from the studio that I loved back in the day, I'm sticking with their original budget line. So let's get on with it. We start things off with a quite odd game that's got a bit more horror than what you would usually find on the Specky. Here's Werewolves of London from 1987. This is a very odd game in many ways. Made by Steve Howard and Paul Smith, aka Viz Design, this is definitely a game best played on the Amstrad CPC, seeing as that was the lead version and was also fully finished. This Specky version was converted by other people and is not fully finished. The game will crash when you complete it instead of giving you an ending. According to an interview Howard did with Dreamcatcher, a lot of this was down to happenings at the company that was supposed to release the game, Areola Soft. They filed for bankruptcy right around the time that it was finished, meaning that this Specky version, which was originally supposed to be a full-price release on Specky, eventually came out as a budget game from Mastertronic over a year after it was supposed to come out, well after the CPC and C64 releases. Areola Soft had also released Viz Design's previous game, the also horror-themed Bride of Frankenstein, and this title is naturally more of a riff on American Werewolf in London, with a splash of Warren Zevon. The game's named after his son, and the title music is basically a beeper cover version. Another weird thing to mention here, just as we're looking at this absolutely beautiful Your Sinclair preview, is the existence of something called the Werewolf Rap. This is actually a not too bad hip-hop instrumental, of all things, that mixes up the game's music a little, and I believe it could be found on the flip side of the original CPC and C64 cassettes. Unfortunately, you won't find it on the Specky version. The Mastertronic release is a flippy tape with the Specky version on one side and the CPC on the other. The wafer-thin premise of this title is that you've got a rather bad dose of lycanthropy, and now that you're doomed to roam the streets of London as a werewolf whenever night comes, you're going to take vengeance on the family that cursed you to this existence. There are 8 yuppies to kill and even eat. You pick up a cross from each of them, and the 8 crosses should rid you of the curse. Whenever you get near one of these folks, a cross will flash on the screen, although they also stand out by virtue of being dressed in black. Naturally, the police are all over the shop, and they're going to try and stop you either by jailing you or shooting you, and there'll be more of them plodding about with each murder you commit. It's kind of amusing though that even if you have quite literally just killed somebody right in front of a copper's eyes, your only punishment ends up being a night in the cells. The game only ends when you die, and there's a few items that can help you out along the way. Bandages heal bullet wounds, files get you out of jail early, and torches help you to see in the sewers. This is quite macabre indeed for a Specky game. It is kind of an open-worldish affair where you can actually set upon anyone you see if you wish, even if they are completely innocent, although you're generally better off just trying to take out those who you're actually supposed to, unless you're desperate for health and need to munch on some poor innocent. And I always found it smarter to try and run from the old bill rather than attempting to take them on. The game didn't review well at all on Spectrum, and unfortunately I can see why. A lot of Werewolves of London tends to involve waiting around and following targets as a human until night comes and you're finally able to attack them, and there's so many arcade adventure titles like this that are less monochromatic and much more diverse in their surroundings. And yet, despite everything, I still like this one as much as I did when I was a kid. Sure, it's mostly trudging through streets that all look the same with occasional trips into a park, the tube or the sewers, but it's got a bit of bad taste, a sort of atmosphere about it, and it still brings back good memories. Even if you should obviously play this game on CPC if you're going to, where you can find things such as actual in-game music and a lot more people milling about, not to mention colour, I still get a kick out of this version. Destructo, or The Island of Dr. Destructo, is an excellent shoot-'em-up from the Bulldog label, released in 1987 and coded by Eugene Messina. Once again, this is originally an Amstrad title, but the Specky version is the one I've played, and it's a damn good game. A straightforward one where the clue to what you do is basically in the name. You fly your plane around and blow up other planes, sending them crashing to the floor where an enemy battleship or island or other such fortification is located. The aim is to make enough holes in the structure so that it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. There's 21 levels in total, and while the first couple start out very easy, it's not long before you have to face a whole load of enemy planes that will either crash into you or try and blast you out the sky. The game got some pretty average reviews from mags at the time, which is a bit of a shame, because I still really like this, and it plays like a very hectic single-screen Time Pilot, which is good, seeing as Time Pilot's one of my favourite arcade games. Annoyingly, playing the Amstrad CPC version does make me a little envious. It is undeniably much better on there, what with having far superior graphics, smoother movement, and some really great sound. Much better than either the Specky's rather limp beeps, or the fact that even when the sun's out on the Spectrum, it is still perpetually nighttime. Still, this was the version I had, and it is still definitely a winner for me. A great arcade-type game, and it was only $1.99. There's also an unofficial sequel to Destructo, a Russian game called Mini-Fly from 1994. This one's a bit worse, I'm afraid, as while there's a bit more colour and some catchy in-game music, the movement's a lot slower and much more basic than it is in Destructo. So yeah, while I thought I would mention this total obscurity, you should definitely stick with the original. Here's Kickstart 2 from 1988, a game based on the old BBC trial biking show Kickstart, although it's not actually an official licence, hence why the name is a teensy little bit different. Sean Southern's original Kickstart from 1985 never came out for the Speccy, instead arriving on platforms like the C64 and Atari 8-bit, but this sequel did make it to the Spectrum alongside the other platforms. And yes, once again, the Speccy is not the lead platform. Sean Southern worked on the main C64 version, and this was converted by Icon Design to the Speccy. Once again, it's hard to look at that C64 version and not feel a whole load of jealousy. It's got music, it's got the movement, it's absolutely one of the best budget titles that you can find, an early game from a guy who's later going to do incredible things like Supercars and Lotus 2. The Spectrum version obviously cannot compare. There's absolutely no sound, and the bike controls are kind of broken in that the movement and obstacles gets very screwy a lot of the time, and even if you're in midair you can still jump on absolutely nothing, so long as you haven't already pressed the jump button. So yeah, that's all a bit odd. And yet I still love this. It does feel like a strange forefather of the classic Trials series of games where you're racing either against the computer or a mate over 5 courses, you've got the ability to create your own tracks if you want, and the race can still get pretty intense at times. Admittedly, if you're against the CPU, this largely depends on the tracks that have been selected, as there are some that they're brilliant on, and others where they are totally useless. Even if this is so utterly basic compared to the masterful Commodore release, and even if there are so many faults, I didn't know that back in the day. This was a childhood favourite, and I will always get a big kick out of it. I'm here all week. Rockford. I already mentioned this one back when I did the video all about Arcadia, seeing as Rockford was supposed to be one of the 2 launch titles for the arcade alongside Road Wars, but eventually the arcade version of this game never ended up coming out at all. This here is the Spectrum version that originally hit the shelves in 1987 on the MAD label, or Mastertronic Added Design, and gee, well, this is one of the first games that I ever remember playing. I'm never entirely sure just what the first Speccy game I had was when I got the system in 1990, but this was definitely one of the earliest ones. Anywho, this is a Balderdash game, one that clearly has a license, seeing as Rockford is the name of the character in First Star's 1984 original, which is also mentioned in the inlay. You have 5 different characters and worlds to choose from: the Hunter, Cook, Cowboy, Astronaut, and Doctor. Aside from the sprites, the main difference in the worlds lies in challenge, with the Hunter's levels being the easiest and the Doctor's being the toughest. There's 4 levels per character, 20 in total, and a lot of gems to collect. This is certainly the first Balderdash type game that I played, and it's a formula that I usually enjoy a lot, so it's not a surprise that Rockford here still gets a big thumbs up from me. It's certainly got a bit of challenge about it, especially in the later levels, and some of them do require you to do the odd different thing, such as when the Doctor has to create a path for both oil and fire to meet each other and cause a big explosion so he can get through a wall. It's a simple game in many ways, but having played a fair few Balderdash type games on the Speccy over the years, I still think that this is one of the better ones kicking around. It's totally natural to follow up the appearance of Rockford with this game right here, Rockman from 1985, and not just because the names are very similar. When you bought Rockford, you also got this game on the flip side. Not a bad deal at all for £3, especially seeing as this game is also quite good. The aim of the game is similar to Rockford in that you have to collect things once again, mushrooms in this instance, but this is a bit more like a platformer, one where our hero can also use his hammer to knock down rocks, clearing a path and also bonking ghosts with them. In short, it's kind of a hybrid. There's a bit of Balderdash, but also a bit of Lode Runner. I really like this one. It's quite in your face, especially with the bright colours and sound effects, and it does have a nice kick to it, with plenty of these single screen levels being real head scratchers that will often have you reaching for the restart button. The movement is a little bit gritty, just like Balderdash. Sometimes that can be annoying in a game like this, although you soon get used to it. It's a very likeable game, really. I still enjoy this, and both this and Rockford are also amongst the very few games that my parents enjoyed at all, which is a little bonus. Also, there is actually a bit of pedigree behind the game, and a name you may possibly know. Rockman is the first game created by a then 15-year-old Dean Carter, who went by the nickname The Smiling Assassin. Dean would also work on the two Druid games for Firebird later in the 1980s, before joining Bullfrog in the mid-90s, and he's best known for his work with his brother Simon. Dean and Simon Carter were the co-creators and main designers of the original Fable, so they've certainly had a pretty big impact on games as a whole, and they're both still active in the industry today. And it all started right here with Rockman. It's not unlike an acorn that falls on the ground and grows into an oak tree, isn't it? After those two good games, here's something different. A pretty generic game that I remember enjoying a lot when I was a kid, but haven't played in probably about 25 years, not until now and making this here video. Alas, this isn't one that's held up well at all, but I didn't really expect it to. This is Speedboat Assassin, a 1989 game from the Mastertronic Plus label, developed by Binary Design. In this instance that means Danny Whelan and Ben Jackson, who also worked on a bunch of Specky and other 8-bit ports of Arcadia games and others, ranging from R to Road Wars, not to mention the Spectrum port of Double Dragon. There's not a lot of info here, but Danny Whelan was a long-time friend of Steve and John Pickford, who we'll be seeing more of soon, and unfortunately he passed away far too young in 2009, aged 42. Now, as I say, this game hasn't held up too well. It's not terrible in the slightest, but it's just the sort of thing that the Specky doesn't do that well, being that it's an arcade shooter type game set on the water, where you simply dodge mines and take down towers, enemy ships and the like. It's a 16-bit type game only on the 8-bits that's generally competent, but lacks character. For £3, it's acceptable. Amusingly enough, this Specky version is actually better than the Amiga original. That one is absolutely awful, and hated by most anyone who played it. Whelan and Jackson didn't do that one, by the way. There are a couple of curiosities here. This game reminds me the most of the likes of Atari's Hydra, not to mention the equally ban-average Bimini one on Mega Drive, although Speedboat Assassin actually predates both of those games by a year. I also wonder, what with the timeline and who developed it, if this game, or at least the 16-bit version, was ever considered for the Arcadia Super Select system, as it seems like the sort of thing that would have fit on there. A middling game indeed, but it's fun to have another look at these strange little things that your brain decides to keep in its memory banks. Speedboat Assassin is a pretty cool as hell title for a game, so maybe that's why I still remember it after all these years. Most of the games that we've covered in this video have been pretty obscure ones, but this next one definitely isn't. It's one of the signature works from a guy who already had a proven pedigree, is amongst the better known creators of Specky titles, and back in the day it was yours for all of $2.99. This is Gregory Loses His Clock from 1989, and one look at the graphics should immediately tell you that this is a game by the almighty Don Priestley, he of the likes of Trapdoor, Popeye, Minder, and Benny Hill's Madcap Chase. Indeed, Gregory Loses His Clock is actually Priestley's final game. He decided to return to teaching following its creation, as he felt that game development was moving more towards team efforts, as opposed to the individual creation that he preferred. So what we have here is essentially the culmination of all of Priestley's efforts, of his signature style, refined through all the other, mostly classic games he did up to this point. And the result isn't just Don Priestley's final game, it's also his best game. Considering that Don mostly worked on licensed titles in his career, it's great to have a wholly original game like this one. Gregory Loses His Clock is Priestley without any form of restriction, and the result is as wild as you might expect. The premise here is that Gregory, our perfectly ordinary hero, goes to sleep and his timepiece gets stolen and broken into 5 pieces by ghosts, and now he has to venture into several sections of the dream world in order to get the pieces back so he can get it restored and wake up. This is the classic sort of Don Priestley game, really. An item-based puzzler where you have to complete tasks in order to get those pieces back, whether it's fixing a bunch of leaks, or finding the original paintings in an art gallery. The movement is much like other Don Priestley games in that it is slow, but then that's what you expect in a specky game with sprites that are this big, and it's a small price to pay for the game being so lovely to look at, everything so full of life and colour. Don Priestley's style is so instantly recognisable, and Gregory Loses His Clock is the best example of it, for my money. There is also the odd bit of platforming and duking it out with enemies here, and again, even if these aren't perfect or as sharp as you would find in an arcade-style game, it's cool to see a game of this style trying to do it. You sense that this is Priestley pushing his style about as far as it can go on the spectrum. This is rightly quite the celebrated title, and if you're not familiar with the work of Don Priestley, I'd say that this is actually probably the one you should play first. It's a definite classic and a great introduction. Certainly better than Benny Hill's Madcap Chase at any rate. We move from one game based on time to another, although this one is a bit more straightforward. Chronos, A Tapestry of Time, is a shoot-'em-up from 1987, yours for a measly $1.99, and while it's not usually thought of as amongst the Spectrum's best, it's one of the first space shooters that I ever played. A trio called the Radical Tubes made this game, and they consist of 3 youngsters. You've got the Tatlock brothers, Stephen and John, responsible for the coding, design and art. John Tatlock will soon go off to become an artist at Software Creations in Manchester straight from school, and while I'm not sure if Stephen joined him there, the third guy in the team certainly did. The musician. Said musician is the man, the legend, the Tim Follin. Even if there wasn't also a game here, this would be worth loading up just for the opening music. This incredibly spacey creation that somehow, through some sort of process of alchemy, is coming out of a single channel beeper. This music sounds as if it's from another world. It sounds impossible. Genuinely one of the most staggering things I've heard on a specky, and Follin would do this on a few other titles, including Agent X 1 and 2, both of which were also made by Stephen and John Tatlock, and were pretty close to being included here. Once you finally press the any key and make your way into the game itself, you're greeted with something that's not quite as amazing as that opening music, but is still good all the same. Chronos is actually not a bad entry-level sort of shoot-'em-up, so it certainly served a purpose for me back in the day. The game is like one big level split up into 6 zones, with no pesky multi-loading interrupting the experience, and while there's no power-ups or anything, a lot of the enemies are pretty basic when it comes to movement. The game itself is monochrome, with background colours that change between zones, occasionally into something less palatable, but the art here is good, and there is room for the odd cute reference here and there. You know you're playing a British specky game when Jethro Tull gets randomly inserted into one of the zones. You make your way through the zones and, kind of like Scramble, a lot more of the challenge often comes from making your way through tricky corridors and narrow passages as opposed to the enemies themselves, and eventually you face a final boss that moves like the old DVD screensaver. Beat that, and Chronos himself gives you a little message before sending you over to the next loop. Reviews for this game were largely average, with most criticism being over the game being pretty generic more than anything, but this was a pretty cool introduction into the world of shoot-'em-ups for me. Sure, I probably could have made a better pick from the corner shop shelves, but I certainly could have picked worse. Our last 2 games are the sort that are most assuredly still gems, regardless of how old they are. This one's the almighty 180, the greatest darts game ever made. I did do a short video on this game several years ago, but it bears repeating. This little title, with the disembodied hand flying around the board, is still the king of the whole genre, the virtual titan of tungsten. A couple of familiar names worked on this 1986 title. The code and design was taken by Gary Hughes, who's got a good bunch of credits over the span of 30 years in the industry, and the art was thanks to a young Steve Pickford. Again, we'll get to him and his bruv more on the last game in the vid. Obviously this game is all about the Yeras, so the premise should be pretty bloody obvious, but 180 can be enjoyed either with a mate, through a quick round-the-clock tune-up, or by facing off against 3 computer opponents. The first 2 are randomly selected, and the third one is always Jammy Jim. Annoyingly, the TZX version I have here only ever picks Del Boy Desmond and Devious Dave, but there's also the likes of Beer Belly Bill, Limp Wrist Larry, and Tactical Tell kicking about. Jammy Jim, the final opponent, is naturally the hardest. You can only beat him by hitting the 9-dart finish, although you only have to do it once. The art style is absolutely wonderful. It's classic British comic stuff, the sort of thing that reminds me a lot of Viz, especially when the opponent's throwing and it's matched with the ridiculously catchy music, courtesy of the great David Whittaker. Still one of my favourite games, this one, and yes, still the best darts game. For many people, the only other computer title that can match this one is Wacky Darts by Codemasters. That's also really good, and it's also by Gary Hughes, so in many ways that's an unofficial sequel to 180. I do prefer the original, but it's nice to know that Gary Hughes has what many people would consider the number 1 and number 2 best darts games ever made on lock. And so we come to the final game of the vid, and happily, it's a very good one. A stylish game full of character that goes way beyond the £2.99 price tag. This is Zub from 1986, and it's the first game to be co-designed officially by the almighty Steve and John Pickford, aka the Pickford brothers, both still very active in the world of games today and responsible for titles like Feud, Glider Rider, Plock, Wetrix, Naked War, and plenty more besides. And here they're doing their first game together under the wing of frequent Mastertronic dev studio Binary Design. There's 2 versions of this, but naturally we're going with the 128K version here, as that's pretty clearly the one to go for. Originally this game was supposed to be called Zob, but the title was altered when it was discovered that Zob is a French slang term for cock. Either way, Zub is a game about an alien private named Zub, who is recruited by Kin Zub and promoted to Sergeant Zub to retrieve the green eyeball of Zub, one of the crown jewels, located somewhere in the Zub solar system. The plot, all found in the inlay, is actually quite funny, certainly a whole lot more than you usually get in an 8-bit budget title. The Pickfords liked to create comic books and designs in their teenage years, having a few pics printed in the pages of 2000 AD, and that's something they still do today. The character also extends to the fabulous James Bond parody and intro, and the title screen. Again, there's lots going on here. And happily, none of this flashy design and animation compromises the game itself. It's a really cool title where the levels consist of jumping onto platforms, moving to the next one above, and continuing till you reach the end of the level at the top. Naturally there's aliens that'll try to knock you off these platforms, and Zub has a blaster to try and take care of them. You do get bonus points if you shoot accurately, so try not to get too gung-ho if you care about score. This game has one of the best chickenometers going. Zub gradually turns into a skeleton as he takes damage, and obviously the game's over if he becomes fully skeletal. The game kind of feels like an evolution of the old Imagine game Jumpin' Jack when it comes to finding your way up a stage through the use of these platforms, although I find Zub to be a lot less frustrating than that title. The character really helps it along, and there's also excellent music that plays throughout. This is courtesy of David Whittaker, and it's another thoroughly catchy track that's amongst my favourites of his. There's even room here for an Easter egg, a whole other game. Entering a code allows you to play a little shoot-'em-up called Light Farce, a purposefully clunky affair knocked up in an afternoon, seemingly on the day before Zub's deadline, as a bit of a piss take of FTL's Light Force, which was getting a lot of rave reviews at the time. This was also released on a Sinclair user cover tape a little later on, under the name of Zarjas. There's so much cool little stuff to be found here, so much that people wouldn't generally accept out of a budget title. But then that was the ideal for these games. When the likes of Mastertronic boss Martin Alper proclaimed that the budget games they were releasing were more than a match for the full price titles, games like Zub were the sort that proved the point. This clearly isn't, as Jeff Minter once assumed of Mastertronic's library back when they first made waves, a dog end. Zub is a great little game, and a wonderful debut for one of British gaming's most iconoclastic duos. with that, we finished looking at 10 Mastertronic games that were amongst my childhood favourites from the studio. Happily, even if some of them aren't necessarily the best versions of a title, most of these games have still held up pretty well for me, and there's still ones that I enjoy going back to, whether I'm playing them for a video, or just firing them up for no reason other than having fun with a good old specky game. I'm sure you have similar childhood faves, whether they're from the Spectrum or elsewhere, and I'm sure that that's something you'll shout about in the comments. Hopefully though, you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now. The ZX Spectrum. 40 years old this year, don't you know? And as has often been mentioned, people still make games for it, really good ones, a lot of the time. A lot of these new games were available to play at the last event that I went to, Crash Live at the Bescott Stadium in Walsall, a wonderful gathering organised by the Revival folks that didn't just celebrate the computer's past, but also its present and future. While plenty of the old classics were certainly on hand to have a go on, a whole army of speckies were also full of newer games to play, the likes of Power Blade fan sequel Delta's Shadow, pretty and classic feeling platformers like Nixie the Glade Sprite, exceptional ports of classic arcades like Asteroids and Joust, some of the best from the ZX Spectrum next, publishers like Midnight Brew and Chronosoft demonstrating and selling a lot of these new games, several of Zosa's staggering modern titles like Metal Man, Angels and Valley of Rains, and other games that have generated plenty of interest in years past, such as Castlevania Spectral Interlude. This list of games represents some of the system's best over what has been an incredibly fruitful last few years, but I think the one that really caught most people's eyes is a game that's only a couple of months old, something called TCQ, or Triangle Circle Square. The sort of game that just shows what can still be done with this humble micro all these years later if you just approach design and coding in a way that, if you'd done it back in the system's commercial life, would have probably seen you given a Manic Miner style boot directly out of the door. Let's have a look at it. TCQ is the creation of a Brazilian coder by the name of Paulo Andrés de Matos Villalva, although you're probably better off searching for Amowex. If you do that, you'll find his site, his itch.io page, and all of his games. Paulo has a good few games under his belt, both regular PC stuff and also a couple of games for the Mega Drive that he's worked on with another group called Manganga Team. Paulo also, from what I can gather, didn't actually become aware of the Specky until 2014. This isn't necessarily someone who grew up with the system, in other words. So the historical conventions of what makes a good Spectrum game aren't necessarily something that he's aware of, and with that comes a whole new perspective. When Paulo discovered the ZX Spectrum, he absolutely fell in love with one of the quirks of the system that, back in the day, was absolutely considered one of the system's biggest limitations, that being colour clash. If you know the Specky, you probably know all about colour clash. If you play any of the classics from the early mid-80s, chances are you'll find plenty of examples of it. Games like Chucky Egg, for example, or Saberwolf, or A Day in the Life, or something egregious like Jack and the Beanstalk. There's lots of it going about. Particularly when the 128K Specky came around in the later part of the decade, colour clash was really seen as something to be avoided because it made the system look weak, no matter what. Some talented artists would work around it brilliantly. You see that in games like Dan Dare, or Cobra, or Rex. Others would put big borders around their sprites in order to protect them from the clash. That's a trademark of the works of David Perry and Nick Bruti. Others still don't seem to care too much about the clash at all. It's kind of a hallmark of the Oliver Twins Dizzy games that they're absolutely chock full of clash, and clearly, they didn't give a toss. Perhaps they liked it too, and the game sold regardless. But the most common method of avoiding colour clash was to strip the system of its colour entirely. Games became monochrome. Was this a good thing? Well, they thought it was at the time. Better to have just one colour than to have any clash at all. Some, however, might think it makes games look a little soulless, in all honesty, particularly these days. Back in the day, decisions like this were taken from much more of a commercial standpoint. Nowadays, that's not really an issue. So if someone like Paolo loves the idea of colour clash, of what happens when all these different hues come together like paints on a palette, he can embrace it without any inhibition, and that's exactly what he's done with his Specky games. His first one was a demake of DevWill 2, a game that he originally released for PC, and there's also a Mega Drive version of. You play as this cute little devil, and in something of a Metroid style, you go around the map obtaining various abilities such as sliding and double jumping. The graphics are wonderful, and you can see how Paolo likes to use colour clash here already. You can also see some of the more unconventional traits of his games. He really likes repetition on these flick screen games, throwing quite similar screens out at you in a way that's just enough to keep you a bit disoriented without things actually getting samey. It's quite interesting. His second Specky game is another one he'd already done. Virgil's Purgatory was originally made for the Game Boy, and this Specky version takes things up a couple more notches, with wonderful graphics and an aesthetic that's based off of the Divine Comedy. You chuck your head at monsters, Decapitag style, and once again you have a big map to go through with different areas and appropriately different music for each area. The Metroidvania is quite strong in this one, and the Specky MSX version of Virgil's Purgatory was given some rave reviews when it came out last year. And now we get to TCQ. Triangle Circle Square, released a couple of months ago, is Paolo's first entirely original game for the ZX Spectrum and MSX platforms, and this is very much the game where the guy's love for colour clash is really driven to something of a logical conclusion. As the name might suggest, this game is all about geometric shapes. In the description and post-mortem of the game, Paolo breaks down some of the inspirations behind this game's aesthetic, and they're quite highbrow indeed. He and a friend named Louis Souza had a concept in place where the game would not be just inspired by the work of the Russian abstract painter Vasily Kandinsky, but that the game would be created by the artist himself, or rather this fictional version of Kandinsky who died in obscurity as a junkie in the 1980s. It appears as though an emulation of Kandinsky's style was unfortunately a bit tricky to do on the humble Specky, and therefore Paolo looked for inspiration in the works of another abstract artist, the modernist Piet Mondrian, founder of the Distigi or Lee style movement, the man who took the concept of abstraction and reduced it to no more than the three primary colours and simple geometric shapes. The guy who doesn't just get inches in the papers nowadays when one of his works sells for a phenomenal amount of money, as they do, but also when it's discovered that one of his famed pieces, New York City 1, has been hanging upside down in galleries around the world for 75 years. And hey, the ZX Spectrum can certainly do geometric shapes fine enough, so if you want a computer to fix up a Mondrian-inspired game on, well, the Specky is certainly up to the job. As you might expect from all the build-up, the game itself is this quite artsy-looking platformer with pretty straightforward controls. O and P move left and right, and Q performs various actions depending on what shape you are. You change shape by hitting the various icons as you come across them. The circle is the only shape that can jump, and the triangle is the only shape that can fire a laser, useful for killing enemies and getting rid of barriers in your way. The square doesn't have any triggered ability, but it can dissolve weaker platforms as it moves across them, opening up new areas in the level. The life situation is pretty straightforward. You have infinite, and you'll start at the beginning of a screen if you die. This is all very indie platformy, and I suppose if you were looking for a relation to this game, you would find it in Mike Biffel's excellent Thomas Was Alone, another game that immerses itself in geometric shapes and also got quite a few comparisons to the work of Mondrian when it was released back in 2012. This has a rougher, distinctly specky sort of vibe though, and certainly no Danny Wallace narration. Instead there's a fine and pumping AY soundtrack courtesy of Sergei Nilov, who even provides a version of the legendary No Limit by 2 Unlimited for the game's scrolling stages. The game itself is on the short side. Once you learn the game, you can probably blitz through it in around about 15 minutes, but it's certainly a cool enough experience that you may well want to repeat it, not just to try and see if you can finish it with as few deaths as possible, but also to have a proper look at what's going on when it comes to how Paolo has played around and designed these levels. it does contain some of those elements that you'll find in the previous games. Here though, the art of using repetition tends to come via returning to a screen as a different shape and having to play through the screen totally differently, which requires its own workings out in terms of design. And the way that he's used colour clash is quite a joy to see. He's not just chucked it about in a random fashion, but he's used it to do things like play with light and shadow, or simulate scrolling effects, or to give the impression of stages being very layered indeed in ways that you don't really get on the Speccy. To the game's credit, it's not something that you really get completely lost in despite the nature of these graphics. A fair bit of care and precision has gone into creating this little world, and it's lovely to see. It is quite something to have a game like this, it has to be said. After 40 years, the ZX Spectrum can still surprise you. And it can surprise you in a way that doesn't require upgrades, or things that you simply wouldn't be able to do on a regular Speccy in its heyday. From a tech perspective, TCQ is not exactly reinventing the wheel. It's created using Jonathan Caldwell's multi-platform arcade game designer, the latest version of a very easily accessible tool that has been used to make absolutely no end of games over the years, particularly platformers. What the game has done, simply, is to reverse an equation. It's taken something that was at one point considered the ZX Spectrum's greatest flaw and treated that as if it's the system's greatest strength. It's all gone in an entirely different direction, and the result is this very striking title that is absolutely worth the recommendation, whether it's on here or on the MSX version, which is basically the same. The price of admission is perfectly fine too. If you go to the game's itch.io page, then you can pay what you want for a download of the tape image for playing in your emulator of choice, with the default being a couple of quid. Thoroughly fair. There is also a physical release of the game available to buy on the Technamic website, although at the time of this video that's currently sold out. And hey, you can even download and fiddle around with the source code in MPAGD, if that's your bag. I love this game, and I presume that it will be right up there when the bods at magazines like Fusion and what have you consider what the best new Spectrum games of 2022 are, and I hope that it achieves even more attention beyond the Speccy scene. Things might be a bit different if that happens, mind you. I do think that when the likes of Castlevania Spectral Interlude got a fair bit of attention a few years back, it was the sort of thing that was treated as a bit of a flash in the pan, this weird little one-off. But really, nowadays, the quality of new Spectrum games and the regularity of which these games are released is becoming something that's harder to ignore and gathering more and more steam. It's why an event like Crash Live could feel thoroughly comfortable in putting tons of new games on display as opposed to focusing solely on the classics, and why names from the past like Crash and Zap64 have now been resurrected under the Fusion Retro Books branding. The Speccy's colours are, in the end, as bright and as clashy and as garish as they've ever been. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little look at an excellent new game, but until the next time, bye for now. This right here is an emulator. Now, sorry to start by beating you with the assuming you're stupid stick, but it is quite an old emulator, as you can tell by the sheer DOSness of it. Specifically, it's a ZX Spectrum emulator called Warajevo, and it's the first emulator that I ever properly used. I'd heard about how emulation allowed you to play old arcade games through programs like MAME, after that was featured in just about every mid-late 90s game magazine going, but I didn't have a computer anywhere near good enough for that, nor was it really good enough for using 16-bit console emus like Genesis or ZSNES. However, as old and creaky as it was, It turned out that it was good enough to emulate my first ever machine, one that I had no way of playing at that time because my real Spectrum had broke and all my games were up in a loft in black bags, and as it turns out, covered in rat droppings. World of Spectrum was my guiding light, the place where I picked this program out from a list of the various emulators available, and then set about downloading all the games I remembered and plenty else besides from there A to Z. Seeing as the file size of these various TAPs, TZXs and Z80 images wasn't ever any higher than a little over 100 kilobytes or so, it wasn't all that stressful for my 56k modem either. I loved Warajevo, and I spent a pretty decent chunk of time using it. It was, in many ways, my first real introduction to emulation, something that, if I'm honest, has been more important to me than anything else in gaming. The idea that, even if you didn't have your old systems anymore, you could still play those games was, well, huge to me. Back then, it was the thing that I now used to play the likes of School Days or 3D Death Chase, and now seeing it in action has a whole other level of nostalgia. But there is something else lurking here, something hidden in plain sight that should be plainly obvious by the emulator's name, although as a teenager who only cared about playing my old favourites, it never quite registered back then. Warajevo has quite the story behind it when it comes to the program's creation, something that's unique to it. Yes, as with many emulators, it's the work of hackers, a passion project, something produced as part of a hobby that you're dedicated to. It's your spare time. But that's much more significant when your work time involves being on the defensive lines of one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 1990s, in a city under constant bombardment where even the most basic foundations of living are hardly guaranteed. Warajevo came from Sarajevo circa 1993, right in the middle of the Bosnian War, and the story of this program, and the duo who created it, as they have told it various times over the years, is quite amazing. To understand the whys of Warajevo's creation, it's important to at least have a little look at the state of emulation back then. For a lot of people, there isn't much of a history for emulation beyond the time when MAME was introduced to the public consciousness in 1997, and everyone became aware that they could now play Pac-Man on their PCs. But it goes back a lot further. In fact, the first ever available emulator was made by IBM for their 709 mainframe computer all the way back in 1958, and it allowed programs for their earlier 704 computer to be emulated, programs that a lot of old 704 users would still wish to use on their newer systems, something heavily desired in the commercial and scientific establishments where such a computer would be used. Emulation as it relates to computers has always been about a bit more than just playing games. Certainly from the 1980s onwards, with computers now smaller and more accessible, it became a worthwhile pursuit for plenty of hackers. Can you get a machine that, for example, runs on Z80 code to run this piece of software that was made for, say, the 6502? That's the sort of experiment we're dealing with here. To create an intermediary, a program that'll allow that entirely different software to run on a machine that it wasn't designed for. A worthwhile pursuit indeed, and you can find all manner of these experiments from the 80s and early 90s, some of which even made it to magazines and the like. This feels like a good place to introduce our two Bosnian coders, Željko Juric and Samir Ribic, creators of the Warajevo emulator and, as you might expect, ardent Speccy fans. At this time, in the early 90s, Željko and Samir were both in their mid-20s and studying at the University of Sarajevo's Faculty of Electrical Engineering, but as the Bosnian War began in 1992, their studies would be turned upside down. The story of how Warajevo was made can be pieced together a fair bit. Željko and Samir have both written about it a couple of times over the years, including on the World of Spectrum website. They note that they originally became aware of emulators for the ZX Spectrum in 1991, not long after they had both acquired IBM PC-ATs, for a rather obscure and not very fast DOS emulator of Slovenian origin. This emulator was called Roman ZX, written by Peter Kosej, and reportedly it could be found on Serbian bulletin boards in the summer of that year. Even if this emulator was very early, low on features and quite slow, The mere existence of it appears to have attracted some attention, including from Željko and Samir, and eventually they wondered if they could create a better DOS-based emulator. Development on what would become Warajevo officially began in February of 1993, and Samir gave the program its name in June. It appears that for a long time, Roman ZX was the pair's only reference point as far as other Speccy emulators went. After war broke out and Sarajevo was put under what would be a years-long siege by the Serbian forces, they certainly didn't have much in the way of access to the internet, or indeed much information at all. Because of this, they did miss what was undoubtedly the breakthrough moment for Speccy emulation in most of the world, the release of Gurton A. Lunter's legendary Z80 emulator in the middle of 1993. This shareware program was several orders faster and more accurate than any Speccy emulator that had come before it, and generated a whole load of attention in Speccy communities and beyond. Lunter's Z80 was a whole new ballgame, and it has rightly taken its place in the pantheon of the most important emulators of the decade. Željko and Samir only heard of Lunter's emulator in late 1993 through magazines that had come from the enemy's territory, well after they'd started working on Warajevo. They recognised that if they had been aware of Z80's existence before they'd started, they might not have begun work on the program at all. Beyond just trying to see if they could do better than the 1991 vintage Slovenian Spectrum emulator that they'd come across, Željko and Samir's work did have a greater meaning for them. This attempt to bring life to the microcomputer that they'd loved, and that they credited for their own interests in the sciences, the catalyst not just for their academic studies but for what they would do after Warajevo, was by their own admission a link to better times. The times before the war, the times that were spent simply enjoying the ZX Spectrum and hacking away at a computer. Taking whatever snatches of time they had in this period to work on Warajevo was a way to forget about the very real horrors that surrounded them, to, in their words, remove the dark thoughts from their heads. And they were indeed snatches, for Warajevo was created under exceptionally trying conditions. Both Željko Đurić and Samir Ribic were in the army and doing their part for Sarajevo's defence, for a start. And while Željko largely worked on the program at home, it was only something that could be worked on intermittently, whenever electricity was available. Not only was that not guaranteed, it was often brief. At best, there were a couple of hours at night, and certainly not every night. Meanwhile, Samir was working on the program at the army base itself, again reliant on the fleeting nature of electricity and the reliability, or lack of improvised generators. Working on Warajevo was something to do, if possible, between duties and missions. As we'll get into, this sort of situation can create quite a lot of technical challenges, but it can, as we will see, also result in challenges that represent a very real threat to human life. Make no mistake, these two people quite literally risked their lives in order to create this emulator. To start with the challenges that were relatively lighter in the grand scheme of things, well, what about storage? If you're Samir Ribic, using the hard drive in your PC to store your work was pretty much out of the question. Electricity wasn't just fleeting, it was fragile when it was there, especially when you consider that the power generator at the army camp was essentially a hacked-up car engine. If someone did something as innocuous as, say, make coffee, put the kettle on, well, chances are that's probably going to affect the power going to Samir's computer, crashing the system. Needless to say, the frequency of these crashes made short work of the hard drive in his PC. That got fried in a hurry. And so Samir largely had to work on Warajevo with the help of a dozen or so closely guarded floppy disks, used as sparingly as possible not just to conserve them, but to protect them from possible viruses. Even though there was little prospect of having any more floppies available than what Samir already had to hand, they'd proved to be much more reliable than a hard drive in a situation like his one. Samir's primary tasks involved working on utilities for the emulator such as ZX tools that would convert and compress tape files for use in the emulator. Such files and algorithms for compression were most certainly necessary, especially considering that they had so little actual storage space to work with, not to mention the whole floppy disk situation. While Jaco did have a working 30MB hard drive at his home PC alongside a 128K Spectrum, there wasn't any kind of generator there, so while his PC was a bit more stable and as such he could work on the emulator's kernel, again I have to stress, at best he's got a couple of hours a night of actual power, and when the power's off it could easily take days if not weeks for it to come back on. Not that this necessarily stopped everything. There is pen and paper, after all, and both Jaco and Samir made use of that to work when there wasn't any power at all. And what's described here is basically about as good as conditions get. As the pair describe in their story, there were times when the conditions were a lot worse. Conditions in Sarajevo at this time were unspeakably horrible. During the worst periods of the siege there was no electricity, no water, and barely any supplies for months on end. The simple act of getting whatever supplies were available was fraught with danger. Hundreds of shells and grenades were indiscriminately fired into the city by the Serbian army every single day, and in the very worst incidents they could kill scores of civilians in an instant, people who were simply gathering at the city's marketplaces. Many of the streets in Sarajevo were no-go areas. They were riddled with the Srpska nationalist snipers, shooting at anything moving. And even beyond the enemy, the battles in the streets and the mortar blasts, there was basically no civil order. All services had completely collapsed. In the midst of this humanitarian crisis, and while also doing their duties, Jaco and Samir did what they could when it came to Warajevo, whenever they had the chance to, but this was also fraught with danger. When it came to transferring Spectrum software for use in Warajevo, Samir had to go to software pirates in order to borrow cassettes, places that were located virtually on the front lines of combat, which Samir had to reach by travelling through the riverbed. It was far too dangerous to use the streets thanks to sniper fire. In the worst parts of the siege, the pair, as with many others, were changing as people. With scarcely any food available, by their accounts Jaco and Samir were losing a kilogram of weight every week. But even in these most horrid of conditions, particularly in the frozen winters, despite the combat operations that they took part in, they still persisted. The link back to normality that working on Warajevo provided was far too important to give up. After a year and a half or so of work, and despite all that they had endured, Jaco and Samir were ready to release the first version of Warajevo in November of 1994. The Bosnian War was still very much going on, but there was more contact with the outside world. In April of '94, thanks to the intervention and funding provided by the Open Society Foundation, it was now possible for people to access an email service. It's certainly not flawless infrastructure, but it's there. Through this, Jaco and Samir were finally able to get their hands on a copy of Gurton Lunter's Z80 emulator, as well as information on a great deal of the other Spectrum emulators that were already out there. Now that they had a measuring stick, they found that they could be very pleased with their work. With barely any frames of reference, and despite the terrible conditions that they were working in, the pair had created an emulator that was faster and more usable than any other available one, with the exception of the Z80. Warajevo's performance was still very comparable to the full version of Lunter's program. In the original readme for the 1.1 version, they estimated that Warajevo was around 15 to 30% slower than the full version of Z80, although a lot of that depended on what software or game was running. Compared to other emulators of the time, a difference of 15 to 30% between Warajevo and Z80 was still very playable, and the pair estimated that their emulator was 7 times faster than the Roman ZX emulator that they'd originally encountered. Now it should be noted here, when showing 1.5, that the nature of my virtual machine means that programs tend to run way too fast here, rather than slowly. Also, Z80 could have a lot of settings changed on the fly, and it emulated many peripherals and add-ons that Warajevo did not at first, such as the micro drive, although emulation for a lot of these peripherals would be added in due course. Now, on the other hand, Warajevo had some serious positives. The ability to load up any program instantly, for example, and it could handle multi-load programs a great deal better than Z80 could due to its superior tape emulation. The tools that were initially included with Warajevo, such as ZX Tools and ZX Shell, also gave users many other options, such as the ability to convert tapes to other formats, or to maintain a clean database of games that made startup even easier. In later versions of Warajevo, these utilities would be incorporated directly into the program itself. The very first version of Warajevo was released in November of '94 with the help of Gurten Lunter himself, after the pair had been able to contact him and request a copy of his emulator. He was full of praise for their work, agreed with their assessment of how Warajevo compared to Z80, and helped to distribute the original program. Work on the 1.x versions of Warajevo would continue over the remainder of the siege and the war, resulting in 1.1 and 1.2. 1.2 was released in December of '95, right about the time that the conflict was coming to an end. The signing of the Dayton Accords on the 14th of December helped to stabilise the situation somewhat by ending the Bosnian War, and on the 29th of February '96 the siege of Sarajevo was officially lifted with the exit of all Srpska troops from the city. July '96 saw the release of Warajevo 1.5. This version was an important step forward, consolidating utilities such as ZX Tools and ZX Shell into the main Warajevo program, and also allowing users to load software from a real tape recorder if desired. Following the release of 1.5, it would be a considerable amount of time before the release of another version. Željko and Sabir stressed in their story that even though the war was over, conditions in Sarajevo were still a long way from ideal, to say the least. Before the siege began, it was estimated that 435,000 people had lived in the city, and after 3.5 years that number was now down to as little as 300,000. Željko and Samir, along with many others who were left, had lives to rebuild. There were also studies to complete. For Samir Ribic, the 3 years that had been spent up to that point working on Warajevo provided the basis for his final thesis on emulation, specifically emulating the ZX Spectrum on PCATs, providing a full detail on the work that went into the program. He and Željko graduated from their studies with flying colours. Despite the poor conditions that existed long after the war, the pair still continued work on Warajevo. A long part of the delay from 1.5 to 2.0 was down to saving up enough money so that the pair could upgrade their computer equipment, finally being able to purchase new PCs after a time. With this, Željko and Samir had finally achieved their main goal. They now had the power to update Warajevo and make it a proper real-time Spectrum emulator, accurate to the original speed of the microcomputer, regardless of the machine that it was running on. Requirements-wise, the 2.0 version of the program required a processor of 33 MHz or more to run optimally, and happily this makes 2.0 and later versions much easier to deal with in the rather overpowered virtual PC that I'm using to emulate this emulator. Version 2.0, released in February of 1998, also allowed much greater compatibility. In earlier versions of the program, it was impossible to run .tape files that had been created in the Lunter Z80 format, and they had to be converted to what Warajevo used, a format confusingly also named .tape, but considerably different because, again, they hadn't initially been aware of the Z80 emulator. This was now no longer an issue. By this time, the pair were also aware of the great work that had been achieved by others in the field. There was a nod, for example, to James Mackay's excellent X128 emulator, originally released in 1996, and another very significant program in the world of Speccy emulation. Version 2.51, released in November of 1998, would be the final release of the program. By this stage, Warajevo also emulated the Timex Sinclair 2068, the first emulator to do so, alongside the traditional 48K and 128K options, and it also officially had a home on the internet as part of the World of Spectrum website, as it was originally run by Martin van der Heijden, back in the days when its address was still void.daemon.nl. The archives for the Warajevo website do happily still exist on the WOS site as it is now, including all the documentation, the various versions of the program, the story of its creation, and even Samir Ribic's university thesis, all of which has naturally been quite a help when it comes to compiling this video. Happily, at least for me, Warajevo is still very much accessible. It's easy enough to run using a virtual PC system along the lines of PCM, and it'll happily run there just as well as it did on my old goat of a PC back in the day. Well, so long as I don't forget to set the program to full screen so that I don't get a load of garbage whenever I try to load up a game. Of course, Specky emulation has moved on a lot since the days of Warajevo, Z80 and X128. There are programs such as Fuse or Spectaculator that are obviously a great deal more fully featured. But even now, Warajevo, shown here in its final 2.51 presentation, is still a fine emulator. It is ridiculously easy to use, after all. There's not much in the way of configuration required, you just hit start, choose a file, and you're away, playing a game instantly. This was certainly handy for the 13-year-old me, completely lacking in any kind of patience and just wanting to load up Chucky Egg here without any fuss whatsoever. Now, of course, there are inaccuracies, and the compatibility is not exactly 100%. The emulation of the beeper sound isn't particularly accurate to the Specky, but it does still have a nice dirty sound to it. Here's some comparisons between Warajevo and Spectaculator, so you can hear it for yourself. The program is certainly better when dealing with 48K programs, primarily because Warajevo does struggle a fair bit with emulating the AY chip. Said chip wasn't something that Jaco and Samir were hugely aware of, focusing more on emulating the beeper. So yes, anything that uses AY sound can become a little bit of a mess. Out of curiosity, I did try to run a few more modern Specky games on this old DOS emulator, and I ended up with mixed results. Zosia's excellent Angels and Valley of Rains both ran flawlessly, as did TCQ. Castlevania Spectral Interlude and Mighty Final Fight didn't, they both crashed out pretty quickly. Again though, this is probably down to Warajevo being more comfortable in the 48K environment than anything else. But of course, all of this is neither here nor there. We are talking about a ZX Spectrum emulator from the mid-late 90s, let alone one that was created in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the middle of a war. As Jaco and Samir admit in Warajevo's README, the very fact that the program came from the city of Sarajevo, made during the course of a 3-year siege, is likely more interesting to people than the program itself. Over the course of my research on Warajevo, I managed to find an old post by Samir Ribic from March 2003 on the comp.sys.sinclair group. Aside from revealing some more details about working on the program, Samir also mentions that he and Jaco had recently visited a pizzeria in order to commemorate 10 years since development began on Warajevo. In the years since, both have mainly worked as lecturers at the University of Sarajevo, and with it now being over 30 years since development of the program began, hopefully such anniversaries are still celebrated, even if it all must feel like a lifetime ago. The personal memories of using Warajevo certainly came flooding back when I came to boot it up once again, to see just how it still held up. It is, after all, one of the main programs that introduced me to the world of emulation, and for that I will always remember it and give it eternal credit. The story of the program as a whole though? Well, that's a reminder of just how creativity and dedication to a craft can still exist and thrive even in the most demanding, the most terrible of situations. How important it is to have that link to a normality that, even in the darkest hours, people work towards getting back to. I can only end this by simply saying, if they ever happen to watch this, a big thank you to Jaco Juric and Samir Ribic for what they achieved. Thank you for watching, as always, and I hope you enjoyed this story. Bye for now. Right, I've been meaning to get around to this one for a long time. It's nice to cover something more modern for an older system like the Spectrum, and these two games here, well, they may be two of the very best newer Specky games that I've seen. Hell, maybe they're all-time greats. And they're frickin' Aliens games too. The first Aliens Neoplasma game certainly set fire to a good few arses when it was released back in 2019, and 5 years down the road, well, we've got a sequel. Aliens Neoplasma 2 has been available since May, and with that coming out, I thought it was high time I looked at both of them because, well, once again, the quality of these new games never ceases to amaze. The scenes for computers like the Spectrum, the C64, the CPC and the Amiga are all far healthier now than they were at the end of these machines' respective commercial periods, and it seems like every other week there's something new and awesome to look at. New games that you want to shout about and say to everyone that they should bloody well play it now. So that's what I'm doing. Obviously we should start off with the first title. Aliens Neoplasma came out in early 2019, and it's a project by one of the best known groups of heads in the whole Specky scene, the Sanchez crew. Sanchez is a multinational group. In the main it's partly Russian and partly Ukrainian, with the main Russian trio consisting of designer and coder Alexander Sanchez-Udatov, graphics designer Evgeny Ragulin, and musician Oleg Nikitin. Ukraine's Evgeny Zahomlin is the crew's executive producer, and you may know him from the excellent Sinclair channel here on YouTube. As for the Sanchez crew's works, you may know them from various other exceptional modern projects. Udatov first came to serious attention in 2015 for his work on the modern classic Castlevania Spectral Interlude. They released their take on Mighty Final Fight for the Spectrum in 2020, that is probably the best beat-em-up for the system, and they're also responsible for Delta's Shadow, a game that takes inspiration from the NES title Power Blade. That's on both the regular Spectrum and the Spectrum Next, as well as Treasure Hunters, which is a Next exclusive. As you can see, consoles are very much the main muse for the Sanchez crew, particularly the NES, although it would be more accurate to say that these guys grew up and got their start in gaming by playing that most famous of clone systems, the Dendy, before also getting their start on any one of many ZX Spectrum clones. When interviewed by Paul Davis for Crash magazine in 2021, Zahomlin said that basically every city in the USSR had its own version of the Specky, some of which were terrible, but some of which were even more advanced than the originals. The funny thing about Aliens Neoplasma is that it pretty much started out as a side project. It's made using the same engine that powers Delta's Shadow, and was, like several other projects including Mighty Final Fight, worked on by the Sanchez crew at the same time that they were working on Delta's Shadow as their main title. And so, while Delta's Shadow took around about 3 years to develop from beginning to end, the original Aliens Neoplasma was actually only knocked up in all of a few weeks. It was then entered in that year's ZXDev MIA Remakes contest, with the pitch that there had been various unfinished projects over the years that were set in the Aliens universe, and this was an attempt to rectify that, their own fantasy of a ZX Spectrum Aliens-based game. Aliens Neoplasma would go on to win the competition, and even if it was only a short project, it set a lot of tongues wagging. Cause hey, it's a new Aliens game on the ZX Spectrum in 2019. Certainly something a little bit different to those age-old Electric Dreams titles, that's for sure. Rather than directly putting you in the shoes of Ellen Ripley, Aliens Neoplasma decides to tell its own original story where you play as a medical lieutenant named Ashley Smith on a spaceship called Achilles that's shuttling colonists and materials from the Hadley's Hope settlement back to Earth. The ship's computer wakes you from hypersleep and tells you to head over to the captain's quarters for an important meeting. There's just one small fly in the ointment. The captain and everyone else are dead. And there's a whole load of xenomorphs and facehuggers roaming the ship. Other than that, well, everything's just great. As you go through the game, you'll find out more and more about the situation and just what the Achilles computer has to do with this mess, while taking down as many of these monsters as you can. Simple enough, really. The game plays like a classic sort of platformer, quite similar in many ways to the 16-bit titles in the series like Alien 3 on the Mega Drive and SNES, and of course, seeing as it uses the same engine as Delta's Shadow, it obviously plays a lot like that game. It's a pretty fast-paced title, and it uses flick screen as opposed to any scrolling. When it comes to Aliens games, obviously we've got to talk about the atmosphere. Does this have that same ever-present sense of dread that you get from the films and the best of the Aliens games, the AVPs and the isolations and what have you? And the answer is undoubtedly yes. This is most certainly dark enough to give you the sort of feeling that pulls you in immediately. Being flick screen is something that really works in this game's favour. When you think back to the first time you watched those classic Aliens movies, you never knew what was coming next. Sure, when it comes to the second film in particular, you knew that the xenomorphs were all over the shop, but they could come from absolutely anywhere, through the frickin' walls and so on. And you get that here too. Every new screen comes with that little bit of suspense, that bit of dread, as you wonder what you're going to be up against next. The game handles ammo pretty well too. There's refilling stations for both your guns and grenades as well as your health, but you can only have a maximum of 100 bullets and 10 grenades. If you're not too trigger happy, that should be just about enough to get to the next one, but it's easy to expend too much firepower if you find yourself in a panicky situation. You often get these parts where you've just got a few bullets and a couple of screens to go, you hope anyway, and you have to pick your shots so carefully. Hell, even try to avoid the Xenos completely if it comes down to it, and that's highly appreciated. And what about those enemies? Well, you've got the standard xenomorph, and you've got facehuggers. If a xenomorph catches you, you're dead, at which point you'll respawn at the last computer terminal you visited. If you can get distance between yourself and the Xenos, they're actually not too hard to deal with. After all, they do just run straight forward and you can take them out with your pulse rifle. Oftentimes, the facehuggers are actually a much more dangerous enemy. Although they die in one hit, they'll usually come out when you're not expecting it, filling up a previously empty screen with threats. They love to attack in confined spaces, and they love to attack in swarms. It's possible to shake off one facehugger if they do get you. However, if more than one reach you, then you're almost certainly screwed. This is something I hugely appreciate about Neoplasma. When it comes to Aliens games, the facehuggers are normally the most useless enemy of the lot. They die very quickly, and they're usually pretty easy to deal with. So long as you've got distance, it's not a problem at all blasting them. Not so here. I actually died a lot more to the facehuggers than I died to the xenomorphs, because the speed and variety of their movement and attack makes them so much more dangerous, especially when they're running interference as you're trying to make your way through some sort of platforming sequence. At last, the egg-laying scum have been given some virtual flowers, which does make a change to how they're normally treated. As for the platforming and the general moving, fumbling and thrashing about, well, that is absolutely solid. The controls work fine whether you're using a keyboard or a gamepad. Sanchez recommend a Mega Drive style pad for this one because you have 3 buttons for shooting, jumping and grenades respectively. If you're on keyboard, the game defaults to WASD for the movement and BN and M for the functions. That's perfectly fine for me, and I was easily able to get through the game using the keys. Again, it's very similar to what you would find in Delta's Shadow. You get a lot of nice little sequences, often packing a fair bit of movement into a single screen. Floor fans are one of the main traps. If you fall on these while they're moving, then you will get completely gipped. However, they can be stopped temporarily with a well-placed grenade. Indeed, this is what grenades mainly get used for, rather than dealing with enemies. There may be the odd moment where a grenade proves handy, especially as you can drop them down from a ladder, but in the main, you use them for these fans. As previously mentioned, you often have to watch out for facehuggers in these sequences too. It's not always going to be plain sailing. Even doors become something of a threat as you go through the game. They start to malfunction, opening and shutting, and they will crush you. That said, it is satisfying if you ever get the chance to splatter a xenomorph or a facehugger by using a door, Space Crusade style. There's a fair bit to be getting on with, and it's all represented beautifully. The art style is glorious. This is another instance where the high contrast of the specky works so well, plenty of light and shade, the odd subtle use of the good old colour clash. It's like an evolution of some of the best looking classic specky titles, the likes of Rex or Dan Dare. It feels very alive, with loads of great detail. And of course, there is a nice heart-pumping tune to go along with it all, exactly what you want in a game like this. In the end, Alien's Neoplasma doesn't exactly leave people with a lot to complain about. It does just about everything brilliantly. For fans of the films, it is a stunning recreation of that signature atmosphere that's condensed down into 128K, and for everyone else, it's an excellent classic sort of action platformer, one that you can't help but fall in love with immediately. It is bloody fantastic, both here and also on the Spectrum Next. The next version, which came out in late 2022, does feature smoother movement and plenty more colour in the graphics, but still keeps faithful to the regular specky version in most regards. In the end, picking either the regular version or the next version as your favourite is mainly going to be down to personal preference. If there's one thing that could be said about Neoplasma, it's that it leaves you hungry for more. The game consists of one pretty big level, and it does feature 2 different endings, which is absolutely fine for the minimum of $3 that it costs to buy. But yeah, it'd be great to have an even bigger game, wouldn't it? Obviously, when something's this damn good, you want more. And now, in 2024, there is more. May 2024 saw the release of the long-awaited sequel, Aliens Neoplasma 2. This time, the game has been released simultaneously on both the regular Spectrum and the Next. As with the original title, it's available on Sinclair's page, this time costing $8 minimum. Obviously there's links in the description, but the higher price point does mean that there's a lot more game to be getting on with. Neoplasma 2 follows immediately on from the events of the first game. After escaping Achilles, Lieutenant Ashley Smith's pod is recovered by Weyland-Yutani and sent to a secret laboratory. Once again, she's aroused from her sleep in the cryo chamber, and it soon becomes pretty clear that she's not going to be getting a hero's welcome. The sensitive nature of what happened on the ship means that she's got little else except a prison cell to look forward to. And so, the hunt is on again, this time to see just what Weyland-Yutani are up to. Not only will you be up against their security, but naturally you can expect to be taking on more familiar foes. This time there's 3 pretty damn large levels, complete with boss fights and whatnot, so yes, you do get a lot more here. Indeed, the release of Neoplasma 2 does reposition the original title as something akin to a prelude, with this being the full experience. Obviously you should go ahead and play both. From the tense beginning where you're armed with nothing but a screwdriver and you're trying to avoid the guards, to the finale deep inside the scientific and technical facilities, I have to say that this is one of the greatest specky games I have ever played. If I were to redo my specky list, then this would easily be in the top 10, if not top 5. While in many ways it's more of the same thing that you already had in the first Neoplasma, with a lot of the same mechanics such as only being limited to a certain amount of ammo, or essentially splitting the levels up into computer terminals that give you more dialogue and access to new areas, it's a lot more than that. The Sanchez crew really get creative with the action sequences and the platforming, offering a lot more variation on that front and a lot of new challenges. It is certainly a tougher game than the original, although the difficulty is never what you would call unfair, and death merely takes you back to the last terminal. There's no live system or anything like that. It must be said, those terminals do add quite a lot to the game. We do have a fair bit of plot here, certainly more than you would find in your average ZX Spectrum action game, and it's mostly done through dialogue between Lieutenant Smith and the computer AI. It is perhaps not a surprise that the rogue AI from the Achilles ended up escaping the doomed ship with you, but you'll have to work together in this sequel in order to figure out just what's going on and to make your way through this laboratory. This amount of plot is pretty welcome, and it breaks up the action nicely. And again, there is a lot more to that action in the sequel. It's not as if the original Neoplasma wasn't brilliant to begin with, but you're going to need all of your wits here. Xenomorphs can often be found in tricky positions where they won't just run straight at you, and instead may be hanging from the ceiling or waiting to pounce from a ledge. The guards themselves present their own problems with their positioning, and can happily kill you with one shot if they get a drop on you, and the facehuggers are just as deadly as they were in the first title. Being a specky game, the movements of enemies are very set and there's no artificial intelligence as such, but the game does a lot to make those movements a tough job to deal with, and that's down to some mighty fine design. Again, you often have to deal with these threats at the same time as you're trying to deal with some sort of jumping sequence and the like, and here there's plenty more to be concerned about than floor fans and blasts of steam. There's all sorts of lifts and rickety platforms, conveyor belts, reactor blasts, and other obstacles, more than enough so that these sequences don't get old easily, and the game doesn't ever feel as though it's repeating itself, more like it's gradually stretching you further and further. There's also the boss fights, which is always something nice to see on the Specky. You get 3 of these, and while they can be short, they work well, and the final boss is an appropriately tough showdown. And of course, there's the art. The style hasn't changed too much from the original, but then it was already great. And here we've got just the right improvements in detail and additions, even more great use of colour, a lovely mix of monochrome sprites and colourful backgrounds with, again, just the right amount of colour clash here and there. It definitely feels like a journey, 3 separate levels, all of which have their own identity. And they all have their own piece of music too. And again, that music is very nice indeed. In the end, well, I can't recommend this game enough. I started playing it and couldn't really put it down until I'd finished it about an hour or 2 later. It is kind of cliche and in truth silly at this point to say that if a game like this came out back in the day, that it would absolutely blow people's minds. This is enough to blow people's minds now, and it's not exactly an uncommon occurrence in the microcomputer scenes these days. Both Neoplasma 1 and 2 are right up there when it comes to being amongst the best specky games of the 21st century, joining a list of newer gems that's growing ever longer, to a point where it's starting to look pretty good compared to the lists of old classics that we all know and love. Brilliance like these games simply cannot be ignored. Neoplasma 2 does close out not just with the novelty of seeing a QR code in Spectrum form, but also with the tease of another sequel, presumably something that'll close out the trilogy. And with the quality of these games, not to mention the quality of damn near everything else that the Sanchez crew have done up to this point, I already can't wait for it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little video review, and until the next time, bye for now. Let me tell you about a specky game that I really get a kick out of. It's not a whole lot more than a silly little puzzly arcade game at its core, but it's got a nice line in presentation and it's addictive enough to be played over and over. It's the Bobby Yazz Show. Just the name itself is a good one. It makes you think of a silly send-up of all sorts of cheesy yet classic game shows, and indeed it is, kind of. Only naturally it's set in the future and the lives of the contestants are very much on the line. It comes across like something you'd find in The Running Man, climbing for dollars but a computer game that you can actually play. It's a good game indeed. And yet it's not exactly a well-known one, mainly because it's a miracle that it even came out at all in any form. The only reason why anyone can even experience the Bobby Yazz Show is because it was released on a Crash magazine cover tape in the early 90s, several years after it was originally due to come out, one of a whole bunch of games that were due to be released by a studio that disappeared almost as soon as they arrived. I've enjoyed the Bobby Yazz Show, off and on, for 30 years. And now I think it's time to do a little video surrounding the game, and why it is something of a lost classic. Why didn't this game get the proper release that it absolutely deserved? Well, let's find out. Before we get into the nitty gritty, let's take a look at the game itself. The Bobby Yazz Show was originally going to be released in 1988, and it was made by a group called Cyberdyne. The game's creator is a fairly well-known name in the specky scene, Christian F. Urquhart. Urquhart was a star in the earlier days of the system. Specifically, he was responsible for 2 of Ocean's earlier classics that really helped make their name, that being their conversion of Hunchback and the legendary Daley Thompson's Decathlon. Following the Ocean days, Urquhart bounced around, presumably freelancing at various companies. You can find him on games by the likes of Codemasters, Hewson, Mirrorsoft and Softtech. None of these games are as successful as the ones he created for Ocean, but there's still some decent work to be found there. His Cyberdyne branding can be found on a couple of games that got a full release, Ace Software's Executor and Hewson's Gunrunner, for example, both of which are actually quite decent arcade-type shooters, but Bobby Yazz is a much more interesting affair. Bobby Yazz mainly has you play as a ball on a grid, which you see from a top-down view. I've always presumed that it's one of those giant balls for hamsters, only with you inside of it, desperately rolling around for your life. You control the ball through 4 different types of stage which represent a single week of the show, and all of them are actually pretty varied. The first is the colour stage, where you have to move over all the tiles and change their colour, kind of like a top-down Q-Bert, I suppose. The various enemies flying around do not hurt you in this stage, but they do wipe away your progress, resetting the colour of any tile they land on, and you are against the clock. Your biggest threats come in the form of special tiles that spawn at random. Some of these will do good things like give you a bonus or increase your speed, while others will kill you outright, freeze you temporarily, or worst of all, reset the entire stage, destroying your progress. These stages get very hectic very quickly, and they're easily my favourite. You do have a bit of help in the form of some power-ups you can grab, shields, guns and so on, but mainly this is about trying to move as quickly and efficiently as possible while trying to stop the enemies from ruining everything, all while being careful of where you step. It's actually a ton of fun. The second stage is kind of the weakest one. In the blind stage, you simply have to try and find the path to the exit, the problem being that naturally you can't see it. It's nothing more than a maze, but you really don't get much time at all, so any slight screw up can easily result in the loss of a life. Kind of annoying, although these stages are short. The third stage is the key stage. In this one, you have to collect all the keys on the grid to open the exit. Here the enemies are lethal to you, so you've got to watch out for them. However, there's a couple more power-ups, including one tile that will actually end the stage immediately. The final type of stage is a simple bonus affair. You try and roll over special tiles as they come up, and you get a bonus if you meet a target. So you get a nice bunch of variations on a simple grid theme, and everything happens so quickly that nothing tends to get old. When you die, and believe me, you will, you can restart from the last level you died on, and there's 80 separate levels, representing 20 weeks of the show. Although unfortunately there's no proper ending as such, and the game just loops once you get through the 80th stage. Still, the game most definitely shines in presentation as well as gameplay. I love the host himself. Bobby Yazz doesn't say an awful lot, but he does come across as a great caricature of your Terry Wogans or Leslie Crowthers, the cheesy 80s game show host now holding ceremony over a barbaric futuristic show where your life is at stake, and he'll most certainly have a little titter at your demise. The darkly comic nature of it all is also illustrated by the commercials that pop up after every couple of stages for hot commodities like Gleamo radioactive toothpaste or Rocco 11 the musical. The game does do quite a lot, seeing as at its core it's not all that much more than a very simple grid. It could surely be an awful lot more basic, but it does come with a lot of personality. It's a shame that there's not much in the way of music aside from a catchy little title theme, but then that's often what happens on the old Specky. So to summarise, this is a pretty bloody good game. It's certainly one that would have been worthy of a full, proper release. It's utterly complete, and it's thoroughly sound. Most certainly one of the best games Christian Urquhart ever made. Which begs the question, why on earth did this game not come out? It's not like the game wasn't known at the time. In fact, it was hyped up in 1988 by all of the usual magazines, Crash, Your Sinclair, and Sinclair User. It was reviewed in all of them too, scoring very good marks in Crash and YS, while Sinclair User weren't that keen on it. Crash magazine even ran a competition for the game, where the winner would receive both a copy of the game and the popular Mr. Game Show electronic toy. Who remembers Mr. Game Show, eh? It strikes me that Bobby Yazz actually looks an awful lot like Mr. Game Show, come to think of it. So you've got everything. Previews, reviews, competitions, adverts, everything except an actual game. The Bobby Yazz Show just never came out, and the magazines fell silent as to why. There was even supposed to be a C64 version of the game, but that too was never released, and has never been found. What on earth happened? So, the Bobby Yazz Show was supposed to be published by a company called Destiny Software. Who were Destiny? Well, they were a software house run by a guy named Francis Lee, who'd previously been at the head of another obscure label called Starlight, as well as been at the front of the much more well-known Beyond Software, as in the guys who largely scored big with Mike Singleton's games. Destiny came through on a fair bit of hype. They had backing, and they had a few titles that they were ready to put out, in their words, as part of a complete entertainment package, alluding perhaps to something more than just games. A whole range of titles were previewed, and there was word that the label would be home to a new Mike Singleton game called Blueback, as well as a text adventure called Kin from the strangest folks in the whole scene, the St Bride's School, a Victorian-styled cult from Northern Ireland. In the end, only 3 games came out under the Destiny banner: the rather odd shoot-'em-up strategy game Diamond, the also rather odd 3D tunnel game Teledon, and one of the other Cyberdyne games, Yeti, also by Christian Urquhart, which is the most straightforward of these titles, being that it's a run-and-gunner heavily inspired by Raphael Cecco's Exelon. These initial 3 games were distributed through Activision without much problem. Funnily enough, the game Diamond also has a song on its B-side, What a Girl Wants, by indie pop band The Company She Keeps, the video of which just so happens to feature the almighty Rick Mail. I suppose this is what was meant by complete entertainment packages. It appears as though Francis Lee was also looking to set up a record label named Destiny 2. A couple of other games got the preview treatment, and they can be found in the pages of old computer magazines. There's a top-down shooter called 7 Minutes to Midnight, where you'd apparently somehow be miniaturised and shoved inside a nuclear weapon with the aim to shoot electrons before they set the whole thing off. Another game called Trackmaster was actually reviewed by Your Sinclair in January of 1989, getting a very positive 8 out of 10 for what the magazine dubbed a maze game that also featured shoot-'em-up sections and logic problems. However, this too never actually came out, and as of this video, neither this game nor 7 Minutes to Midnight have been found. The St Bride's text adventure, Kin, which was supposed to be released for the C64, is also a lost title, but an earlier version of the game for the Speccy called The Dog Boy was released a couple of years previously. As for the reported Mike Singleton game, apparently called Blueback, well, there doesn't seem to be much information about that title at all. For what actually happened here, I have 8bitag.com to thank. This place is a cool source of information for various text adventure games of the day, if you're into that sort of thing, and the author managed to uncover Destiny's fate through getting in touch with Francis Lee for an article about St Bride's lost adventures. The long and short of it was that after working with Activision for Destiny's first 3 titles, Francis signed a deal with a company called Big Apple that was part of a larger conglomerate for Destiny's future games. However, before said ink was even dry on the deal, the parent company of Big Apple went through a whole phase of management shifting and turning over, pretty much a wholesale takeover that resulted in Big Apple basically ceasing to exist. Francis Lee and Destiny played things out for a little bit, but they weren't exactly privy to all the things that were going on, and they weren't getting an awful lot in the way of money, or anything, as it happened. When it became clear that the whole Big Apple thing had gone to pot, that was pretty much the end of Destiny. They had to cease business, with all of these games going unpublished, even the ones that had been reviewed already. It all seems to have been quite sudden, and presumably there's a handful of games that are still out there, waiting to be found. However, the Bobby Yazz Show was saved somewhat from the void, making its long-delayed appearance on a Crash magazine cover tape in September 1991. As is befitting a cover tape that was released right in the heat of the cover tape wars that happened at the end of the Speccy's commercial life, it's not like it's a special release. It's just another programme on a tape that's stacked with titles, with the main event being Mike Singleton's Lords of Midnight. Yes, we were at a stage in the Speccy's life when legendary games such as this one were being stuck onto the front of magazines for peanuts. But few of the titles that can be found on the front of these magazines have quite the backstory that the Bobby Yazz Show does. However, a couple of others do have. In fact, a couple of other games that were made by Cyberdyne and Christian Urquhart also have a similar backstory. So to finish, it would perhaps be a good idea to quickly look at these other games that were also saved from the abyss: Headler Ball and Master Blaster. Headler Ball is quite an okay little concept. You play as a bouncing ball. The ball has a couple of heights it can bounce up to, plus a couple of bombs that you can use if you get into a tight spot. And yeah, that's about it. You can kind of tell it's also by Christian Urquhart, seeing as it has a few things in common with Bobby Yazz. The concept here is quite cool, being that as a bouncing game it's a little bit like Cauldron 2, only not quite as ridiculously hard. Unfortunately, this is pretty much a demo. There's only one level and a shooter style bonus stage which repeats over and over until you run out of lives. Again, there is a little story here. This game was supposed to appear on a 1990 Hewson compilation called The Fourth Dimension, which was, unlike most compilations, made up entirely of original titles. 4 great and new games at the price of $12.99. Alas, it didn't review well. The titles in question were seen as not being of Hewson's usual pretty high standard, and this kind of seems like a summation of Hewson's rather desperate times in the Spectrum's last years. The odd thing is that while Headler Ball was part of the reviews for the compilation, it didn't actually feature on it. At the very last minute, it was replaced by an already released budget Mastertronic game called Roll Around, kind of defeating the object of the whole exercise. Apparently the game just wasn't finished. But this one level demo did eventually surface on a March 1992 Crash cover tape. In fact, the other games from Hewson's Fourth Dimension pretty much all ended up on cover tapes. You've got Qual, a pretty average top-down tank game, a not too bad isometric puzzler called Climax, and Super Cup Football, which is a bloody miserable football game. Now, if you're a Commodore 64 kind of person, there's a chance you might be shouting at me a little. You may be saying, "But Kim, I remember playing Headler Ball on my beloved bread bin. It did come out, and you're a nitwit." And indeed, it did. Headler Ball was released fully on the C64 as part of that platform's version of the Fourth Dimension compilation, a much better effort than the specky one where you can also find the likes of obscure Sensible Software game Insects in Space and the brilliant Cyberdyne Warrior by the Rowlands brothers. C64 owners can enjoy a complete and pretty good version of Headler Ball, although the odd thing is that this one was coded by Jason Page of Graft Gold, and the title screen credits Cyberdyne for the original Spectrum version. It's kind of an odd state of affairs. The version for the C64 did come out, while the specky original did not, and wasn't released until years later, and then only in the form of a demo, which would also presumably mean that the Spectrum Headler Ball was actually finished at some stage. That's still a little mystery, and certainly a curious thing. What about Master Blaster? This is another one that's from Cyberdyne, and ended up on a cover tape, this time one from April 1990, and also from Crash. This shoot 'em up is another game that was supposed to be released by Destiny. You can find a little preview of it in Sinclair User, where the game didn't have a name yet. This game's actually a pretty damn nifty shoot 'em up, similar to the earlier Cyberdyne game Executor. One of the best top-down affairs I've played on the specky, and it kinda deserves mentioning seeing as it's ridiculously obscure. It's 48K too, and it does a pretty damn fine job of being busy and colourful despite that. As to how all these games ended up on Crash's tapes, I suppose that's partly an outcome of the old cover tape wars. When the time came for every magazine to shove a load of programs onto tapes in order to sell more copies, the call must have gone out for games from everywhere. Mind you, Christian Urquhart did also have a very good relationship with Crash, going right back to the beginning of the fabled magazine in the early 80s, where you can see the teenage coder profiled and hanging out with the staff in the mag's pages. With that in mind, it's not surprising that a bunch of games from his Cyberdyne label that didn't end up coming out ended up here, cause, well, why not? Happily, it does allow us to play games like the Bobby Yazz Show today. Hopefully some of the other lost Destiny games can be found at some stage. But hopefully you've enjoyed this little trip into a ZX Spectrum mystery, and all that's left to say, as ever, is bye for now. I've done a lot of videos on the ZX Spectrum over the years, but while I've mentioned it here and there, the videos I've done are mostly about things from the past. I've perhaps not mentioned what's happening on the Spectrum right now enough, because that's a thing that might surprise people who are less familiar with the incredibly old and seemingly quite antiquated platform that I cover. The one with the colours that all clash with each other, that doesn't do scrolling particularly well, and has the odd bit of single-channel beeper music. The ZX Spectrum gaming scene in 2021 is actually one of the most vibrant around. Now, of course, a lot of old platforms still have people making games for them, and oftentimes this sort of thing is called homebrew. It can be seen as quite a hobbyist thing. Yet the ZX Spectrum does blur the lines a little bit. It is, after all, perfectly possible to make games that may use a lot of the same techniques and software that we used to make them 3 decades ago, and from a technical point are exactly as good, if not often way better, than the standard of games released back in the system's commercial heyday. This is true of a whole bunch of the old micros, in fact. The C64 and the Amstrad are also very healthy here. Indeed, you could almost argue that making a big list of the best games on these platforms might be incomplete if you didn't at least consider some of the best titles from recent years as opposed to purely concentrating on the classics. Just look at Pinball Dreams on the Amstrad CPC, for example. That might be the single best computer game ever released for the platform. You could make a very strong case for it, certainly. And speaking of commercial, well, it's not like you can't sell these games, so long as they're original products. People most certainly still do sell specky games, and people do buy them. There's plenty of good channels dedicated entirely to new Spectrum games, with decent followings, and it's not just an English thing either. Indeed, so many of the titles that have come out from Eastern Europe since the 1990s up to the present day have been astounding, and in 2021, especially with the advent of the Spectrum Next and what we're going to see as people get further and further into using it, and more games made with the next start arriving, it's only going to get better. And there's always going to be lots to come in the classic 128K and even 48K arenas as well. From both relative newbies to vets who have been using the Specky for well over 30 years now. Said people may even include the most famous names from the Spectrum salad days. Which, in a roundabout way, brings us to today's topic, one of the most hyped new Specky games currently out there. Not exactly a shock that, considering that it's a new Dizzy game that has been designed by the creators themselves, Andrew and Philip, the Oliver twins. Wonderful Dizzy has been out for a good couple of weeks now, and it's attracted not just the attention of the heads who are well into the Specky scene already, but more casual folk who are curious to see a new Dizzy game after all of this time. And helpfully, the bar for entry is very low. Wonderful Dizzy costs absolutely nothing, and all you need to play it is a ZX Spectrum emulator. In fact, you don't even need that on your computer. You can just go to yokefolk.com and play the game online without having to download anything at all. Brilliant, eh? I don't even need to weigh things up and tell you if the game's worth buying, because it doesn't cost you a penny. My work here's done. But of course it isn't. I mean, that would just be silly. The new Dizzy deserves more time than that to see just how good an entry it is into this gloriously eggy canon. It's been a years-long labour of love after all. Announced during the first Kickstarter for the ZX Spectrum Next, the new Dizzy's taken a long journey featuring not just the Oliver twins and the generally traditional methods they've used to design the game, but the brilliant people from the scene who've taken that design and made it a reality. By and large, these folk were responsible for the fantastic Crystal Kingdom Dizzy 2017, a remake and reimagining of one of the more maligned entries in the Dizzy series. Programmer Evgeny Barsky, artists Dmitry Ponomazhov, Gerald Bentley, Oleg Origin, Alexander Filyanov, and Marco Antonio Del Campo, alongside musician Sergei Kosov, represent the new blood, the people who are doing excellent stuff on the Specky right now. Old and new? East meets West? Forget about such cliches like that. What you've got here is a team of Specky superstars, no matter how you slice it. Or crack it, I suppose. Because, in case you forgot, Dizzy is an egg. I've played through Wonderful Dizzy a good couple of times now, and have managed to get the game pretty well down into my bones, so I've got plenty of thoughts here. I do have the Olivers themselves to thank. They did invite myself and several other folk to give the game a jolly good testing to in the weeks before final release, to see how the game played and if there was anything that needed fixing. I suppose you want to know already whether it's any good or not, and I can say with pretty much zero qualification that it is. It's excellent. And yes, excellent. I refuse to go for the obvious pun. But there's more to it than this just being a good Dizzy game. There's a lot of cool and new things that Wonderful Dizzy does to make the game more than just a fun nostalgia trip that's not going to have much appeal outside of hardcore Earth appreciators. Fresh approaches to things that the game did in the past that make it a bit more approachable, even to those people who might not have all that much love for Dizzy. For yes, such people certainly do exist. So let's have a look at Dizzy's new adventure in a bit of detail, and see how it manages to roll its way into the 2020s as much more than just a fond reminder of past games. Let's have a look at one of the more notable things first. The graphics. Wonderful Dizzy is, well, it's pretty colourful, isn't it? In fact, it's colourful to a point where it actually feels a fair bit removed from a lot of the other Dizzy games. The artists really went to town on it, and some people have remarked that these graphics don't actually make the game feel a lot like traditional Dizzy. It certainly is different, in a way that's a lot closer to how people approach specky graphics today. One of the specky's more famous, or I suppose infamous, features is colour clash. When different colours touch on the specky, they'll kind of weirdly merge and blend with each other. Back in the commercial days of the system, so to speak, this was seen more like an issue, something to try and avoid, whether you did it with big black lines around the sprites, or just by limiting the amount of colour to use. These days, artists on the system see it as something to work with, that can create neat effects and so on, almost like a computerised watercolour. Wonderful Dizzy is still a 1:8K Spectrum game, and it still has to work with the same 16 colours every other specky game has. But the turning of things like colour clash into something that can be actually used makes the game feel quite vibrant, certainly more than Dizzy games were back in the 80s and 90s. All of this is even referenced in the dialogue at the start, in one of many meta moments. See how Dizzy's boots change colour depending on where he's walking. It's magic. Speaking of dialogue, that's another big addition. Wonderful Dizzy has lots more dialogue than any other Dizzy game, which is probably something you should have expected. Beyond cute references to computer history or other Dizzy games, and giving the egg plenty more character than he's had previously, the increased dialogue also puts this far closer to a proper adventure game than previous titles, and as such it has quite the effect on gameplay. Old Dizzy games didn't have too much in the way of chatter. Most characters you met were basically one and done. You come across them, you get a puzzle from them, you solve it, usually by bringing an item to them, and that's pretty much it. Less so here. From the beginning, you're subtly conditioned into talking to people a lot more because they're going to have more than one thing for you to do, or they've possibly got a hint that can help you elsewhere, or hell, it's just nice talking to them. Tinker, who guards a bridge, is a good preparation for that. When you first meet her, you need to have an item in order to pass her and go to the next area. So, you find it, you give the item to her, and then you pass. Simple, right? Now, in most other Dizzy games, that would be the end of your interaction with this character. You would never have any reason to talk to her again. But then, when you go back to cross the bridge, you actually have to do it all again. You have to get another item, which is quite a surprise. And there's a lot more to be done with her afterwards. Little things like this slowly get you into talking more. If you get stuck, and you most certainly will, it's very much worth going around and chatting, because that may well help you find the solution to whatever puzzle's troubling you. You know, just like a good point-and-click adventure game. It's a very nice merge. And, well, what about those puzzles? They're quite traditionally Dizzy, of course. They're still item-based. It wouldn't be Dizzy if you had bottomless pockets for items either, so you're still going to have to do plenty of item management, finding a nice little spot where you're going to be able to put items down and, ideally, not forget about them. The laser focus on items can play some rather neat tricks on your mind. You can get so focused on game logic that you ignore stuff that's obvious. Now, I really don't want to spoil too much of the game's detail, but I'll give one example that I loved. An empty bucket is one of the items, and inside the mountain section of the game's world on one of the screens, you can see droplets of water coming down from the ceiling. Naturally, you can't get to it immediately. Dizzy logic, adventure game logic I suppose, makes you think that obviously you have to get to this leak in order to fill this bucket. That's just the way things work after all. Or do they? Is there not something else you might have missed that's a bit more obvious, almost like it's hidden in plain sight? Little mind tricks like this are quite fun, and it's not just me who tends to get stuck on them. When I've seen other people play Wonderful Dizzy on Twitch, they seem to get entranced by droplets of water that are inaccessible, so presumably you need to find some dynamite or a pickaxe or whatever to get through the rocks that are in the way. Naturally, we've got collecting to do as well. Those coins dotted throughout the game's world are obviously there for a reason, because this is a Dizzy game, and collecting a set amount of these, or crystals, or diamonds, or whatever, is a core game mechanic. Doing such things tends to lengthen the game by quite a bit, especially when you have to find the last few. And Wonderful Dizzy is pretty meaty for a Dizzy game. It's not as long as Fantastic Dizzy, but even once you have the game in your bones and know everything you need to do, a complete playthrough is still going to take you about an hour and a half. And my first playthrough probably took about 3 to 4 times that. How much of that time was spent being completely and totally stuck with no clue whatsoever what to do? Not a particularly offensive amount of time, really. There isn't too much in the way of moon logic, and the world doesn't get old too quickly. Still, there is a risk that this length can amplify one of the potential things that I often think makes people really bounce off of Dizzy games: death by attrition. Attrition can be the biggest challenge in Dizzy games. There's plenty of enemies about, and even if they don't usually kill you instantly, they can chip away at you, especially when you're stuck. And Dizzy traditionally has no way of defending himself of attacking. Lives are pretty finite too, as are ways of getting more or even of refilling your health. There's always the odd very nasty bit too that is always going to be difficult, and even when you know exactly what to do, it can easily nick a life if you're not paying any attention. The crocodile and the dragon in Fantasy World Dizzy, the shark and the lilies in Magic Land, that sort of thing. Even the tunnels in Fantastic Dizzy. This sort of thing can, perhaps understandably, annoy people. However, much like Fantastic Dizzy, Wonderful Dizzy does play a lot fairer with this. Both games are long, but there's plenty of fruit dotted around. Technically, health is still a limited resource, as this food doesn't respawn once you've used it, but it certainly makes the attrition feel a lot fairer. There are parts of this game where you may well lose a chunk of life if you make a mistake, and you may well even have to start from scratch a couple of times. But Dizzy is certainly a bit more equipped for the challenge of this game than he ever was before. Now, these are just a few things about the new Dizzy game that I really enjoy. Obviously, I could go into other things like the game's plot, based as it is around the wonderful Wizard of Oz and all that, but that's something you should experience for yourself. I do think that it's not only one of the best Dizzy games, certainly right up there with Fantastic Dizzy, but it's actually also one of the most accessible Dizzy games too, which is great to see from a series that's so old and coming back for what, as I said before, could have just been a nostalgia tool that pays no attention whatsoever to anything that's changed about game design in the 25 plus years since this egg was last around. Wonderful Dizzy is absolutely not that. I do think that even if you've never liked any of the Dizzy games that you've previously played, you should still give this one a go. It fixes a lot of issues that people may have previously had with the games, while still keeping everything that makes Dizzy what it is, and the result is a brilliant revival that I really hope brings us more Dizzy games like this in the future. The Oliver twins have certainly done a great job, and any coverage of the game is naturally going to focus heavily on them, but don't forget about the less famous but also important Eastern European team, largely, of relatively newer Specky coders and artists too. They've all come together to make this game as good as it is. And hey, with the strange nature of things lately, why shouldn't we have Dizzy not just be good but also relevant? Bye for now. We're back with some more ZX Spectrum goodness, and today's subject is the almighty Hewson. Hewson consultants weren't on the same sort of tier as the likes of Ocean Software and US Gold in terms of size and commercial impact, but they were one of the strongest of the mid-level software houses. The name Hewson Consultants may well sound more like a firm that builds parts for vacuum cleaners, as opposed to a company that makes computer games, but back in their prime, Hewson built up a solid reputation based on making and publishing, well, damn good games. And all original games too. We don't have any licensed titles here, and in fact we hardly have any sports titles. Just fine work, particularly from the likes of Graft Gold, who published a few games through them, as well as Rafael Secco and others. If you bought a Hewson game, then the chances were pretty good that you were buying something different, and you may well even be buying something that's a bit of a pioneer. There's groundbreaking games put out there by Hewson in a variety of genres, whether it be arcade action, the RPG, or even the train simulator. Hewson did make games for all of the classic 8-bit micros, not to mention a few 16-bit ones, but I've decided to specifically focus on the Spectrum for this video. There's a couple of reasons. The Speccy was always Hewson's home court. Andrew Hewson, the company's founder, first made his name through releasing programming books, starting with Hints and Tips for the ZX80, and even after he formed Hewson in 1982 to release games, there'd be other books released such as 40 Best Machine Code Routines for the ZX Spectrum, as well as his regular Hewson's Helpline feature in Sinclair User, 2 pages full of programming and other assorted tips that ran monthly in the magazine for most of its duration. On the personal side of things, I played and loved a lot of Hewson's games. Back when I started on the Spectrum Plus 2A in 1990, Hewson's games were always on the cover tapes of the 3 big magazines, Your Sinclair, Crash and Sinclair User. Of course, while this was most excellent for me as a little nipper, this wasn't exactly great for Hewson. It was the time right near the end of the original company, when they were selling off their old titles to the mags in order to make any money they could. Still, it was thanks to this that the name Hewson was as familiar to me as a young'un as the likes of Codemasters and Ocean were. The times for Hewson may have been tough, but their games were obviously still good. We've got a little over 50 games here, and I'm sticking to games that were originally published by Hewson, and we'll be taking them alphabetically, although when we get to series of games we will cover those together. Some of the games here are very familiar indeed, the sort that you'll often find cited as being amongst the best computer games of the 8-bit micro years, but there's certainly other great games that have fallen through the cracks, whether they be more simple yet effective budget titles, or others that are a bit more ambitious. And it's about time we started going through them. This is the A to Z of Hewson games for the ZX Spectrum. Let's do it. We start off strong with 3 early games created by one half of the almighty Graftgold, that being Steve Turner. Graftgold and Hewson basically go hand in hand. The duo of Turner and Andrew Braybrook released games for Hewson from 1983 to 1987, and while Braybrook largely concentrated on making games for the C64, Turner made stuff for the Speccy. You almost can't go wrong with a Graftgold game, and here we're beginning with the 3 3D space combat games that make up the SADAP trilogy. 3D Space Wars from 1983 is Steve Turner's first release title, written when he was still working in insurance. It's an early attempt at a space shooter, to be sure, one where there are 24 alien ships to kill in each wave, and after killing as many as you can when they're initially together, you've got to chase them around as they fly all over the shop. Perfectly okay stuff for the time. 3D Sadab Attack from 1984 grounds the action. You're in a tank-type drone and you're looking to hunt down and wipe out all the aliens before they either destroy you or you run out of fuel, and there are both city and countryside stages to contend with. Again, it's not necessarily the best 3D action you can find on the Speccy at this time, but it's not bad. The third game in the Sadab trilogy is undoubtedly the best of the lot, 1984's 3D Loon Attack. We're back up in the skies again, controlling a lunar hover fighter and scouring the surfaces of the Sadab's base, looking to blow up anything you can lay your sights on. This certainly runs a lot smoother than the earlier games, and the movement feels an awful lot nicer. My only major quibble with this, and the other Sadab games, is that the shots follow your cursor even after you've fired them, which can be a little annoying seeing as you have to stay in the line of fire a little bit longer than you'd really like to. But hey, you kinda get used to it after a bit. These 3 games were later released in compilation form as the Sadab trilogy, and they're totally okay. But Steve Turner would generally be more famous for making much deeper and more involved games than this. Indeed, it's not long at all before we return to Sadab for something that's a lot more complex than these earlier titles. Before we get to that, however, we do have a nifty little game called Anarchy before us. This game was first released for the Commodore 64. The original guy behind it was an Australian named Michael Sentinella, and this is his only game. The Specky version here, from 1988, was coded by Dominic Robinson, who we'll be seeing a few times in this vid. He made cracking ports of C64 games to the Spectrum, and Anarchy is no exception. This title is sort of in the Boulder Dash mould, but a bit more violent. It's a top-down maze, but rather than collecting all the gems in the maze, instead you have to destroy all the blocks in the maze. You can't simply destroy blocks that are right next to you, and naturally there's enemies to avoid. You can freeze them with a well-placed shot, but you can't totally destroy them. As has been pointed out by others, a rather obscure UPL arcade game called Raiders 5 served as a clear inspiration for this title, but Anarchy might actually improve on it. The destruction element is a very neat little twist on a rather common formula, and the simple rules that are in play means that you need to think a little about how you're going to shoot down the formations of blocks, especially when you're in a tight area. Naturally, the enemies milling about and getting in the way, not to mention the time, add a lot of pressure on. It's a fine game, and it was also a budget release. Coming out on Hewson's Racket budget label, it was yours for all of £3. An absolute steal of a title at that price point, and excellent on the Spectrum. The next game in the video is the first one that is plucked right out of the top drawer, one of the most beloved titles you will find on the ZX Spectrum. Following the Sadab trilogy, Steve Turner set to work on a wholly different kettle of fish, an adventure game that wasn't dissimilar to the likes of Ultimate's Attic Attack and Nightlaw, but one that was much deeper, a game steeped in myths and legends where a wizard finds and casts spells on a quest to defeat the Lord of Chaos. The wizard explores 8 levels, consisting of over 200 rooms, in order to achieve his goals. The whole process took a fair few months, but the end result was 1984's absolutely fantastic Avalon. In a 2018 interview with Graham Mason for Retro Gamer, Turner's complete change of direction from arcadey shooter action to a massive adventure was partly inspired by comments in reviews for the previous Sadab games that were already bemoaning the large amount of shoot-em-ups that were flooding the market, and also by the success of the aforementioned Attic Attack. The clean design and speedy play of Ultimate's title was a big inspiration, and from there Turner set about creating something altogether deeper, filled with ancient British and Arthurian legend, inspired by his own love of history and fantasy. Avalon, for a 1984 British game, really manages to hit a lot of action RPG notes. You play as a wizard named Marok, or to be more accurate, you play an astral projection of him that's flying around the various rooms, casting the spells and whatnot. You never actually die as such in this game. The projection loses life, and then when that's depleted you start again back at Marok's physical form. However, you'll still have any spells and items that you've picked up along the way, doors will remain open, and so on. The controls are quite easy to learn, and it's all done via the joystick. You pick spells from a list, including one that actually makes you move about. You use a servant spell that you get early on to pick up items and then retrieve them from Marok's inventory. And of course you use the joystick to battle with the various creatures knocking about. Marok doesn't start with any offensive spells, but he will find some soon enough. Something that's also different is that enemies don't just randomly appear on screens, as they do in other games of the time, like Attic Attack. They'll actually pursue you from screen to screen. And crucially, the movement is very fast. Marok glides around all over the shop, opening doors when he gets near them, and there's no in-game loading times to speak of, at all. Said fast movement is achieved by the actual Marok sprite not moving at all. Technically you're actually moving the room about while Marok stays in the middle, and it works out quite well. Avalon is an excellent and rightly very successful game, and it's still a title that's perfectly playable today, which is no mean feat considering that it's an RPG that's over 40 years old. It can honestly be said that there was no other game remotely like this one on the Specky when it came out in 1984, and there weren't a whole lot of other titles after it on the system that could match it. Absolutely a game to play if you haven't. The success of Avalon ensured that a sequel would be coming, and Hewson released Dragon Talk the following year. In Retro Gamer and in other interviews, Steve Turner described Dragon Talk as one of his personal favourites. He'd already agonised over building the base and making the mechanics with Avalon, and so with Dragon Talk he could purely concentrate on the adventure. The base gameplay of the game is indeed very similar, so chances are pretty good that if you like Avalon, you're already going to like this, although there are a few cool additions. One of the big ones is that you can actually recruit people to fight for you. If you pick up a bow and then give it to one of the friendly elves, for example, they'll follow you and attack enemies. That's pretty nice, and naturally stuff like this is essential for solving the various puzzles that are kicking around, of which there are plenty, more complex than what you'd find in Avalon. It's another lovely game, and it was also quite successful, although Turner noted that the sales didn't really improve on Avalon, and in the end we never quite ended up with a trilogy of these games on the 8-bits, which is what was originally intended. There could have also been a new game in the series on PlayStation called Dragon Wrath, although this too never quite materialised. In any case, both Avalon and Dragon Talk are stone cold classics, some of the best adventures you'll find on the computer, without a doubt. We may not have had a third game featuring Marok, but Turner did use the Avalon engine for something a little different. Astroclone, also from 1985. We're going back into space and back into the world of the Sadab Empire, but for something more involved than the more traditional shoot-em-ups we've seen previously. This is a hybrid of a game. Initially, you're in your base, and the game plays like Avalon, only the servant now becomes a cursor which you use to fire your gun at enemies. This initial bit is just to get you started, mind. The core of this game is a big battle against the Sadab, in which you have 15 clone ships at your disposal, and you assign them to the 2 star sectors next to Sol, which is your home. Once you do that, you go into those sectors and fight the battles. This bit plays like a nice and appropriately speedy version of Defender, where you need to destroy the Sadab cruisers in the area before you can move on, gradually taking your ships forward, and ultimately getting into the Sadab starbases, which takes you into combat on foot, Avalon style. It's all about keeping as many clone ships alive as possible, earning reinforcements, and maintaining a numbers advantage in the sectors. There's a lot going on here, but Astroclone isn't actually too tough a game to pick up and play. It's certainly a tough game in general, but it's one I would absolutely recommend. It's right up there with those more famous fantasy RPGs, although Astroclone does seem to have fallen through the cracks a little compared to Avalon and Dragon Talk, and it definitely deserves more recognition. In short, you should just go ahead and play all 3 of them. Of course, they can't all be games like Avalon and Astroclone. Anyone up for some backgammon? Well, here's some backgammon from 1983, and it can even run on a 16K Spectrum, although I suppose that's not too surprising. Honestly, I don't really know how to play backgammon, so I can't tell you too much about it, although we will be seeing more significant games from Mike Mail later on, the person who coded this. I also know that even early Hewson games like this one could be found on magazine cover tapes back in 1991. This appeared on a Sinclair User Great 8 set in August of that year. And well, that's about all I've got here. Battle Valley from 1988 is another budget game from the Racket label. It's not a particularly famous one, and it's rather easy to see why. This is a shoot 'em up, although it's trying to do something a bit different. You control either a tank or a helicopter, but you can't really use both of them at once. The idea seems to be that you use the tank to eliminate the majority of ground defences that can't be blown up from the air, before then moving forward with the chopper and capturing bases, but the instructions are frustratingly unclear. It tells you all about stopping a copter and winching up items, but then doesn't actually tell you how to do the bloody things. Seeing as doing such things is essential to progressing in the game, that's kind of a problem. It's a different and slower paced take on the Silkworm formula, and the game's music is actually really good. I can see some potential in it, but in the end it doesn't quite hit the target, and the seminal conversion of the aforementioned Silkworm the following year basically wiped this out of existence. Ugh, City Slicker. There really aren't that many bad games at all in this video, but this is definitely one of them. This is a platformer from 1986, and it's from the same folks who made the much more famous Technician Ted, which we'll be seeing later on, a little outfit called Search. Technician Ted is well renowned for its difficulty, but City Slicker is a whole other level of frustrating. This is filled with all the typical things you would expect from a micro-platformer, but without any of the actually good bits, and indeed this adds some awfulness that's all of its own. There's the chore of collecting various items in an arcade adventure style, something that honestly makes the tasks in Technician Ted appear inviting by comparison, and all the usual stuff like not being able to touch anything, every jump requiring damn near perfection, or being damaged when you fall any further than 6 inches. But the absolute worst thing is that losing energy decreases the height of your jumping. This is, well, ghoulish. Essentially makes progress impossible. You can refill your energy by consuming items that appear, but what good's that when you can't actually reach them? This is a detestable, absolute wretch of a game, easily Hewson's worst on the 8-bits. It got scathing notes at the time for the sadistic gameplay, its ugly graphics, and even its rather edgy premise, an urban terror type affair where you have to defuse bombs in the city that have been set by a rather stereotypical figure named Abreu. Naturally, you get a lengthy game over sequence if you fail, which you will be seeing a lot, thus making it even more annoying. In short, there is nothing good about this one whatsoever. Complete and utter shit. Fortunately, we can wash the taste of City Slickers out of our mouth with 2 more of Hewson's most famous releases. It's time for Cybernoid, and it's time to introduce a man named Rafael Secco. Secco is undoubtedly Hewson's biggest star coder, and that was pretty much by design. Hewson made a big fin in the mags of getting Rafael Secco to make games for them after he left the struggling Microgen, and he most certainly ended up delivering. Hell, they even released a compilation entirely consisting of his titles, the Secco Collection, and while we're not introducing him through his first game, we begin by looking at his most famous specky game, 1988's Cybernoid, the Ultimate Fighting Machine. Or simply Cybernoid. Cybernoid is in many ways an evolution of 1986's Equinox, a pretty damn good game that Secco made for Microgen when he was a mere 19 years old. Just as in Equinox, you fly your droid through the levels, all 3 of which consist of multiple screens and are chock full of enemies, missiles and other assorted bullet-spewing fortifications, although Cybernoid does have a fair few special tools at his disposal to take care of them, whether it's bombs, a shield or various power-ups. Ideally, you also collect a bunch of cargo from the levels along the way and complete them inside the time limit. It's actually appropriate that we look at Cybernoid straight after looking at City Slickers. In 1986, City Slickers was already considered to be a hopelessly out-of-date affair, a bloated flick-screen platformer, and ultimately a piss-poor game. Cybernoid, on the other hand, is a much sleeker, leaner package. Even if you're flying around as opposed to jumping, the game is just as much of a platformer as it is a shoot-'em-up, and it is still flick-screen. Secco preferred the flick-screen style, believing it played better to the specky's advantages, and Cybernoid, along with the earlier Exelon, which we'll cover soon, showed that you could keep to that style and still make something that really felt state-of-the-art without the use of scrolling. The bright and memorable graphics and excellent music also help matters a lot, but Seko's games really feel like a proper evolution of the formula that was honed by the likes of Matthew Smith years earlier. And of course, like those games, Cybernoid is also rock hard. You will die an awful lot indeed, and the challenge is brutal from the beginning. But as tough as it is, it's one of those games where the difficulty level is worth wrestling with, one that deserved all the success that it got. It was the sort of title that Specky owners pointed to with pride even so far into the computer's existence as something that could compete with games that were coming out on the Amiga and the ST, and you can't blame them at all for championing the title so hard. Cybernoid 2 The Revenge quickly followed on the heels of the original, coming out only a few months later in 1988. And, yep, it's a pretty good sequel. It's generally more of the same, of course. If you enjoyed mastering the 3 levels of the original Cybernoid, you're undoubtedly going to have just as good a time getting to grips with this sequel, where we've got 4 more levels of phenomenally difficult blasting and navigation to get through. The graphics are as good as ever, we've still got fine music to take us through the game, and you're going to get battered and blown up aplenty. While this sequel obviously doesn't do a lot different, you can hardly blame Hewson and Seko. Seko had already nailed the formula with the first game, and there wasn't an awful lot of need to change things. I definitely prefer the original Cybernoid to this sequel, but really it's just a matter of personal preference. Both of them are very good, and they're definitely good representatives for the Spectrum. Indeed, Seko's games really didn't feel right on any other platform but the Spectrum, as was kind of evidenced when the original Cybernoid made its way to the likes of the Amiga, and even to the NES. They're classics, but they're undoubtedly ZX Spectrum classics, as opposed to any other platform. Once again, we move from a rightly famous title to a couple of lesser known affairs, the first being Dilithium Lift from 1983 by Simon Cobb. This 16K title is a pretty fast and furious one. You have to collect the dilithium crystals on the grid, but you have to avoid the 4 lasers that are on the outside, constantly hunting you down. It's a simple affair, but it's a damn difficult one. It's a little bit like Jeff Minter's seminal Grid Runner, although our poor hero here doesn't have any attacks to speak of. In fact, it's even closer to an early Ocean game called Transversion, written by Christian Urquhart, and to be honest, the Ocean game is far better. There's a simple and short-lived bit of fun to be had here when you're just bashing your head against the wall, but the rather basic nature of it does let it down. Oddly enough, while the copyright for this game dates it to 1983, I can't really find reviews for this game until the middle of 1984. If that's when this 16K title was actually released, I can understand why the critique for the game was rather scathing, as it feels pretty outdated for that time. We're going back to board games with Drafts Genius, another racket budget title. This one's from 1987. Amusingly enough, this take on Drafts is actually by Raphael Seko. Not exactly one of his most famous games, but there you go. Anyway, this is a perfectly fine take on good old Drafts. The graphics are about as nice as you can get for a Spectrum Drafts game, and it plays totally okay. What is amusing about this is that it is perhaps the closest that Hewson ever came to a licensed game, seeing as you're playing against Albert Einstein. Hewson never did tie-in games, as Andrew Hewson wasn't a big fan of them and much preferred original ideas, but we do have a clearly real person to play against here, and he's even called Einstein on the back of the cassette. Mind you, it doesn't appear as though Hewson got the rights to use Einstein's image from the notoriously highly litigious estate. Or at least I can't find those details anywhere on the inlay. So it's probably a good thing that Drafts Genius wasn't a big hit or anything. I do remember playing it on a crash cover tape, mind you, so it gets a thumbs up from me. It also gets a thumbs up for the silly dance that Einstein does when he inevitably wins. Next we've got Eliminator from 1989. We're pretty late in the life of Hewson, and this here's a game that was originally on 16-bit platforms. It was coded for the Atari ST by John Phillips, who's most famous for Nebulous, and it looks like this was converted to both the Speccy and Amstrad by Chris Wildsmith, with Phillips providing support. This is a pretty cool rail shooter that's somewhat in the Space Harrier vein, although for the most part your ship travels on the ground, occasionally using ramps that will either provide a jumping point, or occasionally flip your ship onto the ceiling. That's quite a nifty touch. You'll often need to use these ramps to avoid the roadblocks that are dotted around the levels, although these can be destroyed sometimes. It is a tough game, as is often the norm, but it's a good conversion from 16-bit to 8-bit, and there's also some decent in-game music. And hey, while it's not a Spectrum original, it's always nice to see a very cool game that originated on the ST. Contrary to the discourse that's often found out in the wild, a lot of good stuff came from the platform. There's a lot of damn fine games in this video, but if I had to pick my favourite Hewson game, well, it absolutely has to be 1987's Exelon. The first Hewson game made by Raffaele Cecco, Exelon is a flick-screen run-and-gun game, something that may seem a bit odd considering that these sorts of games always scroll. However, Exelon is a game that plays to all of ZX Spectrum's strengths. As previously mentioned, Cecco's earlier Equinox for Microgen is the game where you see his style take form. The gameplay here has more in common with Cybernoid, but the art style is already there, and indeed there's quite a lot of sprites and what have you in Equinox that would then appear in Exelon. You play as a thoroughly tooled up soldier named Vitalk, and the screens in each level always present you with a different challenge, whether there's lots of enemies to shoot, different paths to take, a bit of jumping, or other obstacles and fortifications that need to be blown up with missiles. It's a slower affair than the average run-and-gunner, but it's all about careful movement and good timing. Your ammo is limited, so you can't always go around blasting all the time, and you're often stuck in situations where you need to move sharpish, say if there's a homing missile coming at you and you need to blow up the brain controlling it. The graphics are absolutely tremendous. They're not too busy, but everything just really pops with colour. It's one of the best examples I can think of when it comes to the Speccy's colours being so vivid. And of course, at around the halfway point through each stage, you can don the almighty Exelon outfit. It's satisfying in that this allows you to walk through mines and certain other obstacles with impunity, although you're certainly not fully invulnerable. This is a game that I absolutely love. My favourite Hewson title, my favourite Raffaele Cecco title, and one of my favourites on the Spectrum. It widely got a lot of positive reviews and big sales, essentially making Cecco into a household name on the computer. And that was most certainly well deserved. Bloody brilliant. Hewson aren't particularly known for their text adventures, but they do have two of them for the Speccy. Here's the first of them, Fantasia Diamond from 1984. This Kim Topley penned quest sees you attempt to claim the eponymous diamond, and according to write-ups it features a fair bit of interaction with other characters that are moving around the world, as opposed to the more basic verb-noun puzzles you might find in a more bog-standard game. Admittedly, text adventures are not my strong suit, but the game did get some decent write-ups, and it even won an award at the Grand Prix International du Logiciel d'Aventure, despite not being written in French, so it may well be of interest for those who enjoy a slice of interactive fiction. It's about time for a good, honest, old-fashioned ZX Spectrum arcade adventure, the signature genre of the 8-bit micros. And Hewson does have a pretty good one of those for us. Here's Firelord, a game by Stephen Crow. This fits right in with the likes of Robin of the Wood or Feud. You're a knight named Sir Galahad, exploring a big old map, and you're looking for spells that'll help you knock all his enemies spark out and set you on your way to recovering the 4 charms that'll bring back the Firestone to the kingdom. Much like Avalon, you are initially defenceless, but you'll soon pick up spells that you can fight back with. However, rather than simply magicking the hell out of random enemies and finding pieces of a holy goblet or privy or whatever, the core of Firelord is all about interaction with people, specifically trading items. You find random crap out in the world, you take it to shops, and you barter for the items you actually need for your quest, presenting deals and getting offers and all of that. Of course, you can also nick the items if you want, although you will get hauled in front of a judge and likely executed a couple of times if you're caught. If you're a fan of this classic and quite speedy sort of micro-adventure, then this is definitely a game for you. Firelord is a very good example of the form indeed. Gunrunner from 1987 is another run and gunner, as the title might suggest, although this one's a bit more of a standard affair than Exelon, a monochrome title with scrolling and the like. It's, well, a perfectly okay game, really. Your hero gets a decent bunch of power-ups, including a jetpack and the like, but it is all a bit too grey, and it is one of those games where there's several different sets of enemies, and it's a random choice as to which ones come hurtling towards you. Kind of like Uridium in that regard, but I think Uridium does that sort of thing a bit better. It's half decent, but it ain't gonna trump Exelon. Interestingly, this is a game by Cyberdyne, Christian Urquhart's independent outfit. Unlike other Cyberdyne games, this one did get a proper commercial release, although it's the only specky one that they did for Hewson. Oddly, they may be more known for games that could have been lost if it weren't for cover tapes, gems like the fantastic Bobby Yazz Show. Mike Mail is a name you may remember from earlier in this video because, well, he did a version of Backgammon. I wouldn't normally highlight a programmer just for doing a version of Backgammon, but Mail made several titles for Hewson, and he's certainly their most niche programmer. His focus would be on transport sims. We've still got a while to go for his 2 most famous ones that would take place on the ground, but here we've got Heathrow International Air Traffic Control from 1984. There's 2 versions of air traffic control, although I've gone for the international version because it's the same, only the B-side replaces Heathrow with Schiphol. This isn't the easiest of games to grasp now, seeing as it's dots on a screen, but it is the sort of game where things can most definitely go wrong in an instant, and you could easily end up breaking badding the hell out of a couple of planes if you don't concentrate on giving out the right directions. The age of something like this may show, but it got good reviews at the time, and it's worth some respect. Impossible hails from 1987, and it's another game from John Phillips. This one was released in early 1987, a little while before his smash hit Nebulous. This isn't a hugely well-known game nowadays, but it is a very good one even if it is also quite literally balls hard. You control a bouncing ball in a 3D space, and you've got to smash the cylinders on the track back into the ground or the ceiling, avoiding all the obstacles and doing it in time. Any game where you play as a bouncing ball is usually going to be tough as hell, although Impossible does offer a little bit more control over the ball than the likes of Cauldron 2 do. There's a few different heights you can bounce at, and it's not too long before the game becomes more about overcoming the obstacles than it does wrestling with the controls, where hitting those cylinders feels satisfying and the game actually moves at a decent clip. I really like this. Very difficult, but it feels rewarding. We've got another stranger title next, Into Africa. From the copyright date, this game was originally made in 1987, but it didn't actually surface until 1989, coming out for the Budget Racket label. This is an adventure game where you're trying to unite the different tribes of an unnamed African country before invaders from another country, who have also stolen a treasured golden mask, take the whole place over. You control 5 different people, all of whom have specific abilities that make it necessary to keep them alive on this little adventure. It feels a little like the Lords of Midnight, only with a more modern hue. It's an intriguing game, really. There's not much at all else like it in the Hewson back catalogue, and I can't help but wonder if there's a strange backstory behind it, what with it being held back for so long. Was it meant to be a full-price title, possibly for another software house? It's the sort of thing that would have benefited from a full-price package, a more in-depth manual that makes the whole task and commands a little bit clearer and makes the experience a bit more vivid. As it is, it's definitely one of Hewson's more obscure releases. It only got a couple of reviews at the time, and they were pretty mediocre. Not the best game, but a curious one. Hewson, in their later years, released a lot of compilations. While this was generally true of most software houses, Hewson really were chucking them out there, and one of their most curious ones was a 1990 release called Fourth Dimension. Why curious? Well, you've got the 1988 Mastertronic game Roll Around. Hewson and Mastertronic had a business relationship, and they did run the Racket label together, and then you've got 3 games that are coming out for the first time. The Fourth Dimension releases on other platforms also featured other original titles, including the C64 version of Cyberdyne's brilliant Headless Ball, as well as Insects in Space, an excellent Defender clone that was knocked up by the almighty Sensible Software. Certainly an odd compilation, and as for the original games on the Specky version, they're a mixed bag. We do start with the one that is by far the best, however. This game here is Climax. Coded by Rui Tito, it's a title of Portuguese origin, and it's an isometric game where you need to push egg-like bombs around, shoving them into machines called nuclear power units, and blowing them the hell up. It's a little obscure and tough to get to grips with at first, but it soon clicks. It can be frustrating, especially when certain enemies keep blowing the bombs up before you can reach your destination, but it's nice, bright, and likeable. It kind of reminds me of the sort of game that Costa Panay's Vortex Software would make. It does feel of the same ilk as the likes of the classic Highway Encounter. Anywho, it's a really good game. It's been many years since I last played this back when it was on a YS cover tape, and it was good to see the title again. Night Driver is another pretty early game, this time from 1984, and they can't all be winners. This is a simple top-down driving game where you've simply got to get from one end of the track to the other, but the keyboard controls do make that pretty bloody painful. It's all too sensitive, and the game is very much in your face, stopping to shout at you essentially every time you crash into anything. And trust me, you'll be doing a lot of crashing, especially if you try and do this at any kind of speed. This sort of thing isn't something that's aged well at all, although it doesn't appear to have got particularly good write-ups back then. It's certainly not worth booting up now. The guy who made this, Clive Brooker, did go on to some much cooler games, mind you, particularly One Man and His Droid, one of the many gems of Mastertronic's budget catalogue. We've got the second Specky title from the Fourth Dimension compilation, and it's Kral. This is another game of Portuguese origin and, well, it's a lot worse than Climax, being a pretty frustrating and deathly slow top-down tank game where you move around hunting for aliens that appear once in a blue moon, or gems that may appear when you blow up certain creatures. The presentation is kind of promising, and there's some average in-game music going on, but the game itself just feels very clunky indeed. To be honest, it's the sort of game that you often think of when you see that it was exclusive to a compilation, in that there was probably a damn good reason as to why the game wasn't actually fully released on its own. but considering the original games that were on the C64 4th Dimension compilation, it's fair to say that the Specky and Amstrad got the shitty end of the stick this time around. Thankfully, we have a much better tank 'em up coming up next, Marauder from 1988. We've got a quality name on this production. Keith Burkill, the main man behind some fabulous arcade conversions including Space Harrier, Commando, Ghosts and Goblins and Galaxy Force is on this one, and it's nice to see him on an original game, this one coming from his own little label, KCB Games. Marauder is as smooth and silky as you would expect from a game that Burkill made, feeling like a top-down shooter with arcade pedigree, even if the graphics aren't on that level. There's plenty of blasting to be found here as you take on the role of Captain CT Cobra and take on another evil empire in pursuit of some jewels. The game certainly got a bit of challenge, and while there is the bit of occasional bullshit such as power downs that result in you losing a life, it's generally a fair title, and I really can't complain much about a game that is essentially another take on ZX Spectrum Commando, only inside a big old tank. Marauder appears to have been a decent hit by all accounts. It's certainly got a bunch of excellent reviews, including that ever desirable Crash Smash. A top quality ZX shooter and no mistake. Back to the early days now, and here we've got Maze Chase from 1983. No prizes for guessing what this is. It's a Pac-Man clone. As far as such games go, there's not a whole lot to say about this one. It's a 16K title and the play is thoroughly average. The controls do take a bit of getting used to, but there's a lot of games from these early years that use the number row for controls, as horrifying as that may sound. The man who coded this is John Hardman, who was also the co-writer on 40 Best Machine Code Routines for the ZX Spectrum alongside Andrew Hewson. And in fact, this wasn't his first shot at a Pac-Man clone. Hewson did make a few games for the ZX81 in the very beginning, including a Pac-Man clone called Puckman and a Space Invaders game, but unfortunately the majority of Hewson's ZX81 programs aren't out there. We've got another Pac-Man type game here, but this one's much nicer. Here's Maze Mania from 1989, coded by a little outfit called Gamesman Software. This one's a lot more like Pac-Mania. It's top down, but the camera is closer in and our hero is able to jump over enemies. There are some differences too. The aim here, rather than eating up pellets, is to change the colour of all the tiles, so we kind of have the addition of Q*bert-esque play into the mix, especially seeing as some titles will continually switch between colours when Flippo, for that is our hero's name, touches them. The graphics are probably the most special thing here, because I'm honestly not sure if there's a Pac-Man type game on the Specky that's a better looker than this one. This is absolutely lovely, with beautiful use of colour and some nice animations to boot, all while moving at a decent clip, and then the gameplay's no slouch either. A very nice Hewson game, and one that I actually wasn't aware of before doing this video right here. Definitely something I can recommend highly. Here we go then with another pretty big one. It's time for 1987's Nebulous, a game that you may also know as Castellian, Tower Toppler, Koro-chan Land or Sublime, depending on where and how you played it. While the game was originally a smash on the C64, according to an interview for Antstream with coder John Phillips, the idea actually first took form as a demo on the ZX Spectrum that was somewhat inspired by the smash hit Uridium, another game we'll get to later, only using a horizontal cylinder that rotated as opposed to traditional scrolling. Philips would then take the idea to the Commodore, where it was developed over a few months with a lot of useful input from Andrew Hewson himself, but the game was such a big hit that it ended up getting loads of conversions. There were even versions for the NES, Game Boy and Atari 7800. And of course we've got the Specky version here, which was made by Philips himself. The idea is to take your frog-like creature named Pogo up from his submarine to the top of each tower so that you can blow them up, while naturally various creatures try to stop you. Pogo can't actually be killed directly by these creatures, but they do knock him down and he will drown if he hits the water. Although there are points where you will need to be knocked down a touch in order to find the right path. It's a game where you do need a little bit of patience from time to time, even if the time limit is strict, and it plays perfectly fine on the Spectrum. It's certainly not the best version of the game, but you still get cool, satisfying bits like the tower sinking rapidly into the sea once you finish the level. It's kind of a weird one, this. I feel like I have to be in the right mind for Nebulous, as sometimes playing it annoys the hell out of me, but other times it works out just fine. I can't exactly knock the game's popularity, and I'm sure it must be amongst Hewson's most successful games, if not the company's most successful game full stop. I would imagine it's between this, Paradroid and Uridium. Up next, we have Neverworld. This one's from 1988, and it's another game that originally started life on the Commodore 64, produced by the Finnish coder Jukka Tapanimäki, and converted here to the Spectrum by Chris Wood. The premise of the game is pretty cool. It's a Boulder Dash type game, only one that's much more like a shoot 'em up, where you have to rush around and collect all the gems, but you can also blast enemies while doing it, earning the odd important power-up such as the ability to break through a wall. You move around very quickly, and there's also teleports that you're going to need to use here and there. While the premise is cool, I think this game is a bit too unfair. Not for any controls or enemy-based reasons, but because the timer is so bloody strict that you basically can't put a foot wrong, even from the very beginning. While you obviously shouldn't be given all the time in the world for the game like this one, Neverworld does feel a bit like bashing your head against the wall from the get-go, and that lets it down a little. Still a cool idea, mind. I also like the fun factoid about this game, as mentioned by Andrew Hewson himself in an interview with RVG. The face on the game's front cover is actually that of the man behind the game, the idea being based on the game literally coming out of Jukka's head. Apparently Jukka didn't know he was going to be on the cover until the final cover art was revealed. Between the programming books and the name Hewson Consultants, which Andrew Hewson has stated simply came from him previously doing consultancy work back in the 70s, Hewson's early work does make it seem like their overall output would be much more, shall we say, staid compared to what they'd later come up with. Mike Mail was one of the first major talents they found, and his work kind of sums that up. Here we have the two Night Flight games from 1982 and 1983, both of which were sequels to his earlier Pilot, which came out for the ZX81. This is quite an early example of the form on pretty damn underpowered hardware compared to, say, Microsoft Flight Simulator 1.0, also from 1982, and while they most certainly show their age, seeing as they're mainly just groups of dots on the screen that kind of take the form of a one-way, it's intriguing to see such an early flight sim in action on a 16K Specky. One handy feature is the inclusion of a demonstration, so you can see just what a decent landing looks like, and more importantly than that, you can see the game in full flow, as opposed to watching me hammer hopelessly away at a 40-year-plus vintage game in a genre that I admittedly am completely useless at. While these 16K flight sims may not look like much now, these games did get half-decent write-ups back in their time. Pyrocurse from 1986 is an isometric adventure game, kind of in a similar vein to the likes of Denton Design's Great Escape and Where Time Stood Still, although it's generally not as well thought of as those titles. Mark Goodall and Steve Prosser's game sees you attempt to guide 4 adventurers out of an antechamber, and naturally all 4 of them have different abilities that necessitate keeping them healthy and out of trouble. The game does get bonus points for one of these playable characters being a dog called Frosby, who's naturally good at digging up buried objects. This is the sort of game that takes a little bit of time to get to grips with, and it's not necessarily something that's aged the best, but it may well be of interest if you like those aforementioned Denton titles, and you fancy chancing your arm at leading this ragtag group about and trying not to get yourself killed by all the monsters kicking around. Graft Gold, as has already been seen, could scarcely put a foot wrong in the 80s. But if there were 2 games that really summed up just how good Steve Turner and Andrew Braybrook were as a duo, it's hard to look beyond Paradroid and Quasatron because of how wonderfully they complement each other. Paradroid came first, of course. Braybrook's exceptional 1985 game where you have to destroy all the other droids on a spaceship by grappling with them and taking them over was considered one of the best C64 games ever from the moment it arrived on the market, and that standing hasn't really changed in 40 years. While Braybrook was working on Paradroid, Turner was writing an isometric graphics engine that was inspired by the Filmation engine Ultimate debuted with Nightlaw. This would be known as Ziggurat, and rather than making a straight conversion of Paradroid to the Speccy, this engine would be used for 1986's Quasatron, a game with very similar mechanics to Paradroid, but one with graphics that played a lot more to the strengths of the ZX Spectrum. There are other differences between Paradroid and Quasatron beyond the graphics. Here you're always playing as the same droid called Klepto, and the action takes place in futuristic cities. Klepto doesn't completely take over a drone in the same way that Paradroid's influence device does. Once you've defeated another droid in combat, you take parts from them and become stronger that way, although if you only just manage to scrape through a grapple, there is more chance of those parts becoming damaged and unusable. One of the cuter parts is how Klepto's energy is represented by his expression, which changes to a frown if he's starting to get low on power. This is always decreasing, and you'll end up going back to the default layout if it drops to 0, although there are ways to recharge. And while you can shoot droids if you happen to have a weapon, just as in Paradroid, it's also possible to ram them and make them fall from a great height, destroying droids that way. The progression in this game is beautiful. You start off so weak and only capable of destroying the bog standard 9 rated droids, but it's so great when you become strong and you can take out the level 2 and 1 elite droids that whiz around everywhere, not to mention the special ST programmers and androids that are, of course, named after the Graft Gold duo. Both Paradroid and Quasatron are fabulous indeed, and it's hard to really say which one's better. As much as Paradroid is the original, Quasatron is naturally the one I've played an awful lot more. Honestly, it's hard to think of one without the other, and it's a shame that Graft Gold's approach here when it came to the Speccy and the C64 didn't happen more often. A quick note. The sequel to Quasatron, 1988's Magnetron, did start development whilst Graft Gold was still working with Hewson. However, the game was ultimately released by Telecomsoft after Graft Gold jumped ship to them in 1987. This wasn't exactly a straightforward affair, and there was a bit of a legal tussle between Hewson and Telecomsoft over the rights to the game, but Hewson weren't able to sustain such a fight in the courts for all that long. Quest Adventure from 1983 is another text adventure from Kim Topley, where again a lot of the focus appears to be on interacting with other characters in the world rather than simply solving puzzles, although this one does feel a bit more basic and generally smaller than Fantasia Diamond. Again, I do have to be honest and say that text adventures really aren't my thing, so what you're seeing probably isn't doing the game a lot of justice. It's mostly aimlessly wandering about and hoping that another character pops up, and then failing to enter the appropriate word combination. At least that's what it is when I play it. Text adventures weren't really Hewson's thing either. Kim Topley's two games are the only two examples of the form that Hewson put out there, although both of them got a totally decent critique, even if this isn't on the level of the sort of thing that Level 9 or Infocom or whoever were putting out there. Graft Gold is here once again, and this time it's Rana-Rama from 1987. Steve Turner's title here, I believe, is the last game that Graft Gold released for Hewson. We've got a title in the hack and slash genre here, but Rana-Rama is a lot more deeper and involved than simply being a take on Gauntlet. You need to guide our wizard hero Mervyn, who's been turned into a frog, through the different levels of a dungeon. You have offensive, defensive and effect spells at your disposal, there's lots of enemies and projectiles kicking around, and each level contains warlocks that you need to find and defeat. You take these on in a game of ritual combat in which you have to rearrange the letters and spell out the game's title, and defeating them allows you to obtain runes which you can then use to create spells and make your character stronger. There's a little bit of progression to this game from Quasatron, the mechanics are a little similar. Much like that game, what you have here is something that ends up being very satisfying to play through. Naturally, you start off as an utter weakling with the most basic spells, but it's certainly nice when you level up a bit and then cruise through battles. But again, there is always an element of danger. If you don't maintain your psychic energy levels, it's possible to become immortal, and if that happens, well, you're in big trouble. Again, it's a fabulous game. These guys just don't make bad ones. Honestly, it's hard to find another outfit in the 8-bit era that was as utterly, consistently good as Graft Gold. Rana-Rama perhaps isn't quite as well known as some of their other hits. Steve Turner felt that at the time it got incorrectly categorised as being just one of the many Gauntlet clones that were kicking around, but it is just as highly recommended as anything else the studio did. We've got another two slabs of transport here, and this time we're on the rails for what are surely Francis Bourgeois' two favourite games of all time. Here's Southern Belle and Evening Star from 1985 and 1987. These are most certainly Mike Mell's most famous titles, and in both of them you're in charge of a steam train. You need to make sure the King Arthur Class 460 is fully stacked with coal and water, watch those signals, make the stops and all that sort of thing, whether you're travelling from London Victoria to Brighton or Bath to Bournemouth. Again, there's a demo mode so that you can see the game running as it should, which I am thankful for. While obviously the frame rate is quite slow, to the point of it actually being a single frame a second, the graphics here are definitely much more appealing than they were in the likes of Night Flight. What's very curious is how early these games are in a pretty damn niche genre. There had been more arcadey games involving trains before this, the likes of Super Locomotive by Sega, but I am pretty sure that Southern Belle is, by a long distance, the first flat-out train simulator game that was available to the Western market. I'm not sure if it's the first outright, as I don't know what train sim games were out there on Japanese computers at the time, but this is quite a pioneer. And hell, it's not just a train sim, it's a steam train sim, not a modern train. Even nowadays, there's not exactly a lot of games out there that are trying to accurately simulate the operation of a steam locomotive. Mike Mell's games, nearly 40 years later, are still pretty close to just being on their own. In a similar vein to the earlier Maze Chase, 1983's Spectral Panic is another rather simple classic arcade clone by John Hardman. In this instance, the subject is the lesser spotted Space Panic, as opposed to the likes of Space Invaders or Frogger. It's speedy like Maze Chase, but pretty simple on the whole. Eat yourself some fruit and dig holes for the bugs to fall down into so that you can murder them. Controls are as annoying as they usually are in older games of this vintage, although it does kind of end up being weirdly close to WASD, even if it's also completely wrong. Nothing particularly noteworthy here, and Hewson didn't really do a lot of arcade clone games in the end. Probably for the best, as other setups like Ocean definitely fared a lot better in that department. We've had all the other Raphael Secco specky games, and now it's time for his last two outings on the computer. It's the two Stormlord games, starting with the 1989 original. We've ditched the sci-fi trappings of the likes of Exelon and Cybernoid for a more fantastical setting in which our eponymous hero must free the fairies before night falls and they're destroyed by an evil queen. In order to do this, he throws weapons about and solves the odd item-based puzzle, and unlike the previous Secco titles, this is a scrolling game, a quite smooth scroller at that. Stormlord is essentially an attempt to make as 16-bit feeling a title as it's possible to make on the old Spectrum, and it does triumph in some departments. It's most certainly very nice looking, you've even got a bit of an edgy touch what with the odd bits of breast milling about, and there's certainly lots going on, mostly without any slowdown. The only trouble is, well, it's just not that fun of a game to play. The puzzle side of Stormlord is what kind of lets the game down for me, because while they're not exactly complex things, it's full of crappy little gotchas that, if you fall foul of them, end up making levels unwinnable. If you accidentally open a fake door, or put a honeypot in the wrong place or whatever. And honestly, I find that sort of thing really annoying. People didn't find it annoying at the time, it should be said. This got massive reviews all around. Of course, it was a majorly hyped title. Secco wrote a whole programming log for Crash detailing its development, and it is certainly one of the last original releases for the Specky to really get much momentum. Hell, it even ended up getting a version for the Mega Drive, although Razorsoft's take on the game was terrible. You can even play it on the frickin' Oric, thanks to some dedicated fans who made a version of it back in 2010. But yeah, I must confess that this one isn't my favourite. There was also a special demo of the game for Your Sinclair, featuring one small yet still quite difficult exclusive level. Notably, the character you play as here is a little different and smaller than the guy you play as in the final game. There would, however, be a sequel. 1990's Stormlord 2 Deliverance isn't anywhere near as famous as the first game, which is a shame because it's a hell of a lot better. This is Secco's final flin with the Specky before making his switch over to the 16-bits, not to mention his final flin with Hewson, and he absolutely pulls out all the stops. Everything's a lot bigger, including the hero himself, we're still scrolling quite nicely, and it still looks top-notch. Happily, Deliverance does change the main thing that was annoying about the original. Puzzles are completely out of the window, and this one's all about action. Stormlord also gets a new ability in that he can triple jump, and there's lots of sub-weapons kicking about. Bombs, arrows, and all sorts. This does feel more like a true successor to Exelon, a game that's always throwing something a bit different at you, occasionally stopping for a bigger battle and just, well, being a damn good time. As much as I don't like the original Stormlord, I think this sequel's fab and definitely worth playing. Also, it's got some cracking title music thanks to Dave Rogers, who was also responsible for the fine specky music in games like Cybernoid 1 and 2, Battle Valley, and Marauder. The intro song here is my favourite of his though. It should be noted that Stormlord 2, released in May of 1990, was the last game that Hewson released for the ZX Spectrum. The original company would close its doors in 1991 after the funding well finally ran dry, although Andrew would open up his next company, 21st Century Entertainment, mere weeks after the end of Hewson. We've got one more game from 1990's Fourth Dimension compilation, and it's Super Cup Football. Hewson, unlike a lot of other UK studios, hardly released any sports games. Much like licensed games, it just doesn't seem to have been their thing. And so it's perhaps no surprise that 1. The single football game in this video was released in a compilation as opposed to being a standalone title, and 2. Super Cup football isn't very good. It's a quite basic top-down game of footy with very little going on graphically, and it doesn't even really get the rules of the game right. You kick the ball back into play instead of throwing it in, for example, and this does mean that you can score directly from a throw-in, which is amusing. Now, I've played many terrible football games in my time, and this one, well, it's certainly total rubbish, but it's far from being the worst of them. It's mainly just a quite dumb game where you hammer the button a lot and push forward, and you do tend to get lots of goals out of it at least. Certainly a bad football game, but not a criminal one. This isn't Gazza's Super Soccer, which, as it happens, was also made by the same person who coded this game. In the case of a little outfit called Search, we didn't necessarily have the best of times with the first game by them that we looked at in this video. That was City Slickers. However, now we're looking at their hit game, Technician Ted from 1985. The Search duo consists of Steve Marsden and Dave Cook, and here we have a micro-platformer in the very classic vein. Flick screens, all sorts of random objects flying about, tough jumps wherever you go, and a bunch of tasks that you have to complete. Ted, our techie hero, must complete these by touching objects on a screen in sequence, occasionally doing it inside a time limit, and there is a certain order to these jobs. As the instructions say, you make your way from the entrance of the chip factory to the silicone slice store, and then progress from there. This game was a hit, and probably one of the most famous of the specky micro-platformers outside of Manic Miner and Jet Set Willy, but my word, this is a brutal game indeed. There is a certain fun to be had in Technician Ted as far as just fooling around and exploring goes. The graphics, items, the room names are all very creative indeed, but it does become very frustrating whenever you actually try and complete a task, because even the smallest of mistakes will see you punished. And there are, of course, plenty of points where you can get yourself into a death loop, which will quickly see poor Ted get fired and drop-kicked into a bin. The jumping is also a little tough to get used to if you're used to the likes of Manic Miner. Ted can't quite go to the edge of a platform in the same way that Miner Willy can, and as smooth as he is, the jump feels much slower and trickier to judge. In short, this is a red-flagged title, for experts only. I do like the game a lot, and it was probably the first Hewson title I ever played, seeing as it was on my first Crash cover tape from December 1990, but good heavens, it is one hell of a challenge. Seeing as this game was a hit, it didn't take long for a couple of other TED-based games to arrive. However, the actual sequel, 1985's Costa Capers, was published by Telecomsoft instead of Hewson. Still, Marsden and Cook did return to make a special 1-8K version of Technician Ted in 1986, Technician Ted The Megamix. There's quite a lot added here. Naturally, there's a whole bunch of other rooms that even go outside of the factory, where you can find such things as a university, a big radio tower, and even a cruise missile, but the old rooms have largely had a big doing over. There's many more weird objects getting in the way, including a Sinclair C5, and helpfully all the tasks are now numbered so that you don't have to guess at the order you need to do them in. That's certainly handy. The game is still absolutely rock hard, of course, one of the very toughest that you'll find on the ZX Spectrum, but if you fancy your chances at conquering the savagery that is Technician Ted, then I'd go ahead and play this Megamix version. The classical music is even less annoying here, although you will still probably want to turn it off before too long. We've got one more Graft Gold game, and it's a big deal. This is Uridium from 1986. Originally, this came out on the C64. Designed by Andrew Braybrook as something of a cross between Defender and Zaxxon, and given its name thanks to an employee named Robert Orchard getting the name of the element Iridium on, it's an absolute beaut of a shooter where you fly over the Dreadnought and destroy as much as you can before landing and initiating the self-destruct sequence before flying away as the whole thing blows up. It's another Graft Gold classic, and a smash hit that ended up getting lots of conversions, including one to the NES, where it served as the licensed game for The Last Starfighter. And here we've got a pretty good Spectrum conversion thanks to Dominic Robinson, one of Hewson's in-house programmers who would later jump fully over to Graft Gold, picking up and smashing out their fabulous conversion of Flying Shark for Telecomsoft in a matter of weeks. While Iridium is obviously never going to be as buttery smooth on the Spectrum as it is on the C64, and it does miss out on a couple of things including the big old self-destruct sequence, all the important stuff is present and correct, whether it's smashing up the ship or avoiding those dreaded Iridium mines, as well as possibly seeing if you can stay flying around beyond the call to land now and destroy some tougher ships for more points, if you think you're hard enough. With all of that being in place, it's pretty easy to love this classic and thoroughly challenging space blaster. It's the sort of microcomputer game that could have easily, with a graphical glow-up, gone into the arcades and worked perfectly. We also have Iridium Plus from 1987, which is kind of an odd thing. The story behind this specky version of Iridium Plus is that after Dominic Robinson finished work on the original conversion, he still had some more space to play with, so he got together with his design partner, John Cumming, and they knocked up a whole new set of levels in a weekend. Iridium Plus is the result of these labours, and this was released on the 4 Smash Hits compilation alongside Exelon, Synapse and Runarama. Obviously the gameplay is virtually the same, only it's a whole bunch of new dreadnoughts named after chemical elements to destroy, and you can also land any time you want as opposed to waiting for the command to land now, although obviously doing that will mean scoring less points. This is a nice little treat for the folks who enjoyed the original, and it's also an entirely different set of levels to the ones that appeared on the Iridium Plus version for the C64. We've made it to the last game, and we're finishing on a high. It's another shooter, and it's Synapse from 1987. For this one, we stick with Dominic Robinson and John Cumming. However, Synapse is a ZX Spectrum original, which then got converted over to other micros like the C64 and Amstrad. The goal here is the usual shoot-'em-up norm of controlling a fighter, this one's called the Scorpion, and battling your way through the alien's planetary system, and the gameplay is a little Gradius-esque in that you pick up fuel with your fuel scoop, which you hold down the fire button to use, and then use that fuel to activate the fighter's weapon and propulsion systems. Simple stuff once you get the hang of it, and the result is definitely one of the better attempts at a horizontal shoot-'em-up on the ZX Spectrum. It's not quite on the level of all-time classics like the specky version of R-Type, but it's got a lot going for it, and it's nice to see Dominic Robinson, who did a fine job of converting various games like Iridium and Anarchy to the specky, scoring well with an original game for the computer. A great way to end the video. And with that, we have finished looking at Hewson's games for the Spectrum. Hopefully this video's not just done a good job of telling you all about these titles, but it's also done a good job of showing Hewson's history, as well as the history of some of the incredible talents that worked with them. They were a wonderfully consistent group with a lot of classics under their belt, and a legacy that's still very much alive today, whether it's in the many games that were inspired by the likes of Cybernoid and Paradroid, or directly in the work of Huey Games, run by Andrew Hewson and his son Rob, and makers of Hyper Sentinel, Iridium's spiritual follow-up. The large majority of games in this video are certainly worth playing, that's for sure, whether it's here on the specky or on other platforms. So do yourself a favour and get some of these booted up today. Play a Hewson game. Right now. But before you do that, thanks for watching, Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and bye for now.